perfectly in sync, man. Cheers, bro.
Cheers.
All right, everybody. Season 5, episode 12. Super excited about this one. Kurt, 19 years, United States Army. Pops was police officer, LAPD. Super honored to have you on here. We have an awesome fucking studio, which is nice. Thanks to Eli, we're in the super special spot. If we do, for whatever, pause, it's because Eli fell down the hole into the bedroom. But no, so super excited to have you on. We've kind of been doing a lot of first responder podcasts lately. So it's nice to hit the military audience that obviously we're a part of, and that we fund therapy for. So yeah, give us a quick little intro,
Okay.
just a rundown, who you are, where you're from, time in the military, and then we'll kick it off.
All right. Yeah. One, thanks for having me. I appreciate everything you guys are doing for first responders and, veterans and other folks that you guys are making a difference in their lives. It's a big deal. And I've obviously known you for a little while now, and having the opportunity to watch what you guys have done has been, that's been neat to see that. And I know we've talked a lot about me being a guest on the podcast and kind of bringing a little bit of levity based off of my own experiences in the military and everything else I've done in my life, and kind of hoping that, the things that I talk about mean something to other folks that might be listening and or family members, and their loved ones need help. And so that's why I'm doing this. Let's see. Yeah. So starting off for me, born in California. I joke a lot with people, because I've been all over the world, and I'm like, hey man, don't hold that against me.
Especially now in the Bay Area. Everybody's like, oh yeah, I'm from the Bay Area. Like, oh shit, man, I might want to get out of there.
Exactly. No, but I was born in Southern California. My parents, so my dad, like you briefly described in the beginning, my dad was on the LAPD for 27 years, life dedicated to law enforcement. He was an infantry officer in Vietnam. And, my dad was originally from the East Coast, kind of old school blue collar. My family back on the East Coast in Pennsylvania were all steel mill workers. And so my old man was very much, both emotionally and mentally built that way. So tough guy. Vietnam vet, ended up, becoming an infantry officer, was young, volunteered for Vietnam. He wasn't drafted. And, nothing against the draftees, but my dad loved the country, believed in it, and, and thought it was a duty to serve. And so at the young age of 17, with my grandmother's consent, he volunteered for Vietnam, went enlisted first, and then basically showed a high aptitude as a leader, and was identified during that time frame by his drill instructors and drill sergeants that, hey, this guy has the ability to lead at a higher level, and was actually referred or recommended to go to OCS. And so he did. He went to Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning in Georgia, and then ended up becoming a young lieutenant, an infantry officer, and then he served in the 1st Cav in Vietnam, which, if you know anything about military history in Vietnam during that time period, the 1st Cav was air mobile. So a lot of helicopter operations, a lot of landing on hot landing zones, which essentially means the enemy's always there. It's an immediate gunfight when you step off of the helicopter. So pretty intense experiences in his service. And then he would later end up resigning his commission and then coming out to the West Coast, because he actually had some buddies that he served with in Vietnam at the time were on LAPD. And they were like, hey, Mike, you need to get out here. You'll love it. There's lots of action out on the West Coast. And so that's kind of what drew him out. And then he ended up, serving on the LAPD for 27 years. So my mom and dad met in Southern California. So my mom is originally from the Central Valley in California. And, lots of farmers and ranchers and, that type of lifestyle is essentially where my mom came out of. And so, my dad met my mom while she was in college in Southern California. They ended up getting married, having me. And yeah, the rest is history that way. So I grew up essentially between Southern and Central California. And then in high school, moved back to Southern California with my dad because I wanted to play football down there. And, I thought I was going to have this crazy, awesome football career
Like
in
full
college.
ride to
Yeah,
college and
exactly.
professional.
Yeah, because I love sports, right?
Yeah.
And I excelled at them. And, I was really looking forward to hopefully playing ball in college and some things like that. That didn't end up coming to fruition for me. So after I think I took like a 6 month, I worked for about 6 months at UPS loading trailers. And I was like, man, I need to figure out what I'm going to do in life. And nothing against folks that work at UPS. It was a great company, but I kind of, there was something else kind of stirring in me as a young man at the time. And that ended up, with my grandfathers are World War II vets, my dad being a Vietnam vet. My dad was, and my grandfathers were never overbearing about their experiences, but I always knew that those things were, those experiences had shaped them into essentially becoming the men they were. And so I respected them a lot for that, and I looked at that as a very positive thing. And those experiences and kind of the way they were translated to me, kind of left me asking more questions like, well, what if I went and did this? What would that look like? And so, as a young 18, 19-year-old trying to figure it out, I essentially was like, hey man, I'm going to enlist in the Army. So, and I'll never forget my first experience going in and talking to the recruiter. My dad came with me, because he was like, hey, I'd like to come in as well and hear what they have to say. And I remember going in, and it's pretty comical now when I think back on all my experience in the military. But I show up and I tell the recruiter, he's like, hey, cool, man, you want to join the Army, whatever. And I was like, yeah, man. And he's like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want to be a door gunner on a helicopter.
Yeah.
I think I had seen some crazy movie like Full Metal Jacket or something that I was like, oh man, that would be righteous, right? So
that's one of the coolest military occupational specialties I think is out there, right? Like on the Ospreys, and that's like the clip from Bad Boys, like the Coast Guard helicopter in Miami. That's like pitched sideways. And they have the 240, and I'm like, that's so fucking cool.
Yeah, Hollywood does a great portrayal of door gunners.
Yes, yeah. And so it's interesting that you didn't know from like a young age that you were going to go in the military, like with your dad's experience and your grandfather's experience. Like with me, like my dad being a police officer, uncle, grandfather, great-grandfather, I grew up like in a police department and in a patrol car.
Yeah.
Where I essentially knew I was going to join the military and be a police officer.
Yeah.
Where it took you a little while and then you were like, all right, I guess I'll join. But you also had pops and grandpa to look up to and be like, you know what? I like the person that they are after their time in service. So now I'm going to go. Yeah.
It's my high school experience. It was a good one. I went to private Catholic high school in Southern California, and I graduated from Bishop Alemany High School in Mission Hills. That's the school that I went to. Great school. I had a really good high school experience, but even with my dad being in law enforcement and kind of knowing some of the military stuff, when I finished, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Like I said, football was kind of the first dream that I had and playing. And when that didn't happen, I think I found myself trying to figure out where I was going to channel all the energy, right? And it's funny, when I was probably about a sophomore in high school, I was trying to figure it out. And my dad would always kind of bust my chops. And he's like, man, you need to take all that motivation, aggression, and energy, and, you need to join the mill. And at that time, I was like, absolutely not. I will never do it, And it's funny, right? When you're that age and your parents are trying to impart some wisdom on you, whether or not you listen or not, I'm sure all of us have had challenging moments that way, you know what I mean? But it ended up happening, and I was always really appreciative of that with my dad and my grandparents and everything else. So about 18, 19, again, I walk in, talk to the recruiter and, tell him the whole silly, I want to be a door gunner. And he's like, we really don't have that. And I remember at that time, my dad kind of piping up and saying like, what about the airborne infantry? And I was like, well, what's that? And so of course, if my dad would have told me what that meant, I wouldn't have listened. Right. But the recruiter tells me,
yeah.
And I'm sitting there, and I'm listening to what he's telling me. And I said, yeah, man, I was like, that sounds awesome. That's something I want to do. And essentially from that point forward, I mean, I went all in. So, my military experience started for me with joining in Los Angeles at, the MEPS there. I went through MEPS in Los Angeles, which I can't remember what that acronym stands for, but basically
I don't either.
You go through like all your medical exams and all that kind of stuff, and they make sure you're fit to serve and everything else. Of course, I went through that pretty quickly. And I just remember, waiting at a hotel in Los Angeles by LAX and getting ready to fly to Atlanta, Georgia, where I would then take a bus to Fort Benning, Georgia, because that's where I was going to go to basic training for United States Army infantry, to be an infantryman. So anyways, I get to Fort Benning, Georgia, and go through basic training, and I go through airborne school there, graduate successfully, and then head off to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And oddly enough, because of what I ended up choosing to do for the rest of my time in the military, that kept me at one duty station, which I was at Fort Bragg in North Carolina for over 20 years. So that's the beginning for me.
Got it. Yeah. And like every other service member, that's how you get to, right? So,
right.
So you had airborne in your contract.
I did.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So then you go to the basic training.
Yep.
Did you have stress cards back then in basic training?
No.
A little stressed out too much for
it's
the
actually,
Army?
It's actually funny that you bring that up. So, excuse me, edit that.
Eli's so good at editing everything. I honestly want that in there.
Yeah.
It's so much different than doing it in a fucking garage on a poker table that's about to break.
Hey, the ambiance of that is special as well.
It is.
No, so yeah, I mean, basically, going through basic training at that time, I'm a pre 9/11, what I call a pre 9/11 guy. So when I joined the Army, it was the late 90s, right? I joined the Army in 1998. Bill Clinton was the president. There wasn't, I don't think at that time there was any active conflict the United States was involved in. So it was an interesting experience joining the military at that time. And quite honestly, my experience at that time, the Army and the branches of service in general were still very old school. So you had a lot of NCOs at that time that were like Somalia vets, the first Gulf War vets, Panama, Grenada, stuff like that had gone on in past history. And these guys, as non-commissioned officers, were still serving, influencing other generations of soldiers that were showing up. So, so my basic training and my drill sergeants and cadre, I mean, these guys were old, what I still considered old school, and the expectations going through were they were going to make you hard, because, they understood that at any point, the world is a fragile place, and it still is. And, we see current events going on and everything else, and stuff changes rapidly, and those guys really took to heart at the time, doing the best they could to make young 18, 19-year-olds ready to go and face, the nation's enemies. So they were old school.
Yeah.
There were no stress cards for sure.
Yeah. But, and so even during a time of peace, right, where it's like we have a lot of service members that do 4 or 6 years where there may not be a war going on.
Sure.
So I think that's a testament to them to be able to get you in that mindset where it's like, hey, like you always have to be ready.
Yeah.
In case something happens where a few years after you join, we have 9/11.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe touch on that a little bit. So when did you go to, or what was like the timeline? So you go through basic training.
Yeah.
You go through airborne school.
Yeah.
You're jumping out of planes.
Yep.
Do you have any funny stories from airborne school?
Oh, dude. So I've got a really funny one about, and as a cherry, what I call a cherry airborne infantryman.
Okay.
It wasn't in jump school, but it was my first jump at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And here I am, I'm, brand new F&G new guy in this airborne infantry unit. And I get there, we do our first jump, and I literally break my fucking ankle on my 6th jump. So you do 5 jumps in jump school.
Okay.
So I get there and I literally break my fucking ankle on the 6th jump. So, and I literally tried to be as hard as I could about it. So, and what I mean is, so we do this jump, right? I think at that time we were still jumping what they call a C-141, which it was like basically a bigger version of a C-130 jet engine. They're out of service now. I think the Air Force phased them out. So that might be dating me a little bit.
Yeah.
So I jump out of this thing and I end up, landing on the tarmac. So like an actual flight line from this drop zone, a DZ that we jumped on. And when I landed, my right foot was canted a little bit. And, I land and bam, I felt something pop and I was like, oh, fuck.
Yeah.
I'm in a pretty decent amount of pain, but of course I'm brand fucking new. So I'm terrified.
You ain't going to say anything.
Yeah.
Try to suck it
up. I got my ass up, recovered my parachute, and I fucking walked off the drop zone with a broken ankle because I was fucking terrified because I was brand new and I was like, oh my fucking God, like I just fucked up as a new guy.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that was I wasn't laughing because quite honestly, and then at that point, I didn't even tell anybody. I was like, oh, I think I rolled my ankle is what I told like this E5 that I was out there with who was like responsible for me, right? And I remember that night going to the barracks, right? I'm assigned my room and all that kind of stuff. And I am in excruciating pain. I mean, like my fucking ankle is the size of a softball.
Yeah.
It's already black and blue. I'm almost in tears, man. Like, I'm a young dude. I'm super, like, fuck, man, I fucked up. And I remember like low crawling down the hallway to a fellow private, brand new dude as well. And I was like, hey man, I need to go to the ER and get my shit looked at.
I'm like, just imagining you like low crawling, like from all your training that you got and be like, he's in there playing video games or some shit.
Yeah.
And you're just like, yo, like,
dude,
I'm fucked up.
It was not cool. They take me to the ER. Lo and behold, my ankle's broken. I'm in a cast.
Yeah.
It was good though. Like everybody was a good sport about it other than teasing me constantly, good job fucking new guy.
Yeah.
You broke your ankle.
But I'm sure people get hurt way more than just an ankle, right? Like if you come in hot on your landing zone, you probably some broken, I'm sure that some people medically retire out of airborne school.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't know what the statistics are there, but certainly injuries doing high risk training.
Yeah.
And airborne is considered high risk training. Yeah. So at that time, later on in my career, I would end up jumping what we call square parachutes, which are much more steerable when I was a free fall guy and all that kind of stuff in special operations. But when you're jumping a round parachute that literally you're like grabbing a riser, and that's how you steer yourself. And that's how you also break yourself to slow down, right? As you're drifting to the ground, like you're still going to have a certain amount of force and impact that there's nothing you can do about, which is why, in the airborne community, they're always like, hey, airborne, keep your feet and knees together, right? That's like a common saying.
Okay.
So that way you don't hurt yourself. I probably have literally 1,000 TBIs and and everything else just from being on. And I was on static line jump status my entire career.
Which means what?
Basically, so static line parachuting is, where you have a parachute on and it has a static line and you hook up inside of the aircraft to an anchor line cable that, you're not essentially deploying your parachute yourself unless you have a malfunction. And then you're utilizing a reserve parachute that's provided as well.
Got it. So after 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it rips it.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. And you can YouTube all of it and see like, crazy videos where, dudes it's called a toad jumper. and a guy's like, the main parachute doesn't deploy, and the guy's literally being towed by a static line, and he's just like smacking the side of an aircraft.
Talk about fucking trauma, man.
Yeah, exactly. That alone, would probably be a fairly traumatic experience. Luckily,
I'd say
I never
so.
had anything like that happen in my airborne career, but I certainly had, again, the broken ankle, some pretty rough landings where I hit my head pretty hard.
Yeah.
And different experiences like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so that
we can dive into a lot.
Yeah,
on
pun
this.
intended. Pun and fucking intended. So you get through airborne school, and then when did you reach the point where you were like, okay, I'm going to go to Ranger school or put in for Ranger and that whole process?
So, like we were kind of talking about, my experience in the Army, 9/11, kind of all that stuff came to fruition when I was a young non-commissioned officer. I just made E5, so I was a buck sergeant, right? That's what they call it in the Army. And I was in basically, the different branches of service have, it's essentially professional training to professionalize the force, right? And they do that for both the officer corps and the enlisted corps, right? So for non-commissioned officers at that time, you went to a course called Primary Leadership Development Course, or PLDC was the acronym. And again, young E5, just starting to lead other soldiers. I'm in that course and getting ready to finish that course, and that's when 9/11 happened. And I can vividly remember what I was doing when I watched the plane. I think it was the second one. Obviously, the first plane had hit, and of course, we were in the chow hall because it happened in the morning. I think we obviously had gotten up early, had already done PT. We were eating chow. I was having a cup of coffee, and of course, there was a TV in the chow hall, and it was like, hey, something's popping in New York City. And we turned, of course, everybody was glued to the TV because we were all young leaders in the Army at the time. Yeah, I mean, everybody, if you're an American and you don't know the history of that, you should be ashamed of yourself. But obviously, all that transpired. And of course, that moment would change my military career, forever, and kind of set me on a course to essentially that led me into special operations and everything else. So you asked about Ranger school. So I was a young NCO first, and then I actually attended Ranger school as a E5 in a regular infantry unit. And I went through and graduated in 2002. So about a year after 9/11, and then, got Ranger qualified and came back and thought I was the hardest thing since sliced bread.
Yeah. And so once rewinding just a little bit, and it's kind of like that scene from American Sniper.
Okay.
Where Bradley Cooper, he's like in the bathroom or something, and that chick's watching the TV, and she's like, hey, come over here.
Mm-hmm.
And the plane hitting the towers is on the TV, and he's like, basically like,
it's on.
Game on.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I can, very similar feeling when you're in a room with your peers and, most of the folks that I was around at that time were from a combat arms military occupational specialty, which is essentially their job in the military. And I can distinctly remember looking at all the guys and us kind of collectively saying, like, once we understood it was an attack, we were like, we're all going to war.
Yeah, like pretty much that's when the lights changes from off
like
to
a
on.
Switch,
where it's,
man. Yeah.
It was like, okay.
And I remember it's funny because there's certain things over my career in the military, at times I've had, I think, some trouble remembering certain things, like all the details, but there are certain things that really stick out in my mind. And obviously those moments, when you kind of look back and go, like what was kind of a catalyst, right, to transcend to all these different experiences, that one obviously was a big one. So I vividly, like I said, remember that.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then any of those guys that you're with in the chow hall, were they deployed immediately, or some of your buddies, did they go overseas immediately? Or
so basically at that time, I was still in the regular Army, And I think maybe basically all of us stayed in PLDC. So nobody left, right, to go deploy with their unit, because I think at that time, you had different special operations units spinning up. I mean, there's tons of books out there now, Jawbreaker and all these other books that were written about Afghanistan, about who was first in, what they were doing, et cetera. And, of course, Ranger Regiment, Special Forces, right, Delta Force, the SEALs, all those guys, essentially being the tip of the spear, were the first guys to get called to go and, do damage on, America's behalf, and go after bin Laden. So at that time, none of us realized how long that, the conflicts were going to end up being. Yeah. So everybody finished school and then went back to their, respective units, and then guys would start deploying after that.
Got it.
So
then after you finished that leadership development course, when did you go to Ranger School after that? Like how many months? What was the time difference?
Yeah, I graduated in May of 2002. So if I back that up a little bit timeline wise, I think maybe 6 or 7 months after I went to PLDC, I ended up going to Ranger School. And there were a couple other things I did in the regular Army. Like I became a static line jump master, and I went as an infantryman. There was a deal that you could do as an infantryman, which you could earn your expert infantryman's badge, which pre 9/11, was a big deal, because when you go to combat in the Army, you're awarded a combat infantryman's badge, right? But before all that, you had an expert infantryman's badge, which basically meant that you could demonstrate all these different tasks proficiently
and you
as
were
an
tested
infantryman.
on them.
Yeah, and they tested. So,
Okay.
And it was a badge you could wear on your uniform.
Yeah.
And
anything shiny to slap on the fucking uniform looks good, man. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that basically all that, and then Ranger School. Then I came back from that, and I think around that time, about I was still an E5, but I would then get promoted to staff sergeant, so an E6. And during that time period, Iraq was getting ready to kick off. I hadn't been to Afghanistan yet. This was 2002. And I was like, hey man, like the ultimate test, for any of us in combat arms is essentially to do your job in combat. And at the time, my unit wasn't tasked to go anywhere. And I was like, I'm going to go somewhere that is going somewhere.
Yeah.
And, being Ranger qualified, being a jump master, some of these other things that, I'd worked to be in the military, I looked at going to a long-range surveillance company, which the Army doesn't have those anymore now, but I ended up re-enlisting in the Army, and then going and interviewing with, it was called Fox Company 51st, which really interesting lineage if you get the chance to check it out. But basically they were, the LRP dudes of Vietnam. So small 6-man teams behind enemy lines, like all Rangers, right? All going and taking the fight to the enemy. And so I was like, hey man, that's what I want to go do. And at the time, the 18th Airborne Corps, which is a massive organization, you have like all these different divisions underneath it, like the 10th Mountain Division, the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division. So a massive organization, but it had a long-range surveillance company that was assigned to do some of the most important kind of reconnaissance missions for the Corps, right? And that was, you kind of worked directly for, I think it was like a 2 or 3 star general or whatever that was the Corps commander. And so, yeah, so I was like, dude, that's like legit, right? So I want to go do that. So I went and interviewed with the first sergeant, and really good dude. I'll never forget him. First Sergeant Murphy, big jacked monster of a dude. 75th Ranger Regiment combat vet, like just had a pretty strong presence, right? And I went in, interviewed, and he's like, yeah, man, you got the job. And so I re-enlisted, and I went over there and became what's known as an assistant team leader. So I got over there and then immediately deployed, because right when I got there, the company had just pushed forward to Kuwait to get ready for the invasion in Iraq. So kind of a segue into my first combat deployment that ended up being the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah. Okay. pause you there. Talk about that.
There's so many like intricate details, man.
No, there is. And it's tough to cover essentially 19 years of fucking experience.
It's a lot.
Right?
Yeah. And there's way more important stuff for us to talk about than the nuances of my all the little stuff.
But I think it's important to segue into all that to kind of get like an understanding of like what you do in the Army to get to the point where you were at and where you're going to talk about. So with Ranger School, I know, so a lot of the listeners out there, I don't know much about it because obviously I've never been through Ranger School, but I know people that have gone through it. But essentially in regards to like what we do at the Overwatch Collective with like talking about mental health and really sharpening your essentially basic infantry soldier into the next tier, I guess you can say, for Ranger School. How is that kind of process through Ranger School and like really like sharpening the tip of the spear? And then was there anything in Ranger School regarding mental health whatsoever?
Oh yeah. Well, first off, Ranger School is probably one of the more difficult schools in the United States Army. Obviously it's pretty coveted to earn your Ranger tab. For me, that experience was like a gut check, man. I mean, it was, you're sleep deprived, the chow that you get is limited. I think at the end of that, they weigh you also in the beginning, and then they weigh you at the end. And I think I lost like 19, 20 pounds in 60 some odd days.
So if y'all are looking for a diet, prep for a summer cruise, or
come talk to me and I'll take you through the Ranger School experience. No, but for me at that time, I was a young dude, super hungry. I went into that with a mentality that I was like, I will not quit. I'll do whatever it takes. It'll kill me before I quit. And it's interesting. I think back to some of those moments because, that was my mindset going in. And I had one experience there in the beginning that I was like, oh my God, like I'm on the verge, right? Like I might actually tap the fuck out.
And how far into it was it?
This was literally what they call zero. I think it was called 0 week. I'm not sure what they refer to it as now, but basically they're doing everything they possibly can to attrit the class. So that's through sleep deprivation, constant physical activity, just a variety of different things, to see if you're going to be tough enough to continue
weed some of those people out.
Yeah. And I mean, it was miserable. You know what I mean? The best way to describe it was, it was absolutely miserable. Yeah. And I just remember, there was a dude, a Ranger instructor at the time, an RI is what they call him. And his name was Staff Sergeant Easter, big yoked black dude. And he pulled us out of the barracks, right? And I just remember he has us all line up, right? And I think we had laid down for maybe an hour. Like it was like a cat nap or something, maybe 30 minutes. This guy brings us out and just starts smoking the living dog shit out of us. He's got us doing grass drills. And if you don't know what those are, essentially we're having to move our bodies around each other and do all these movements where you're doing like push-ups and then jumping over each other, and guys are running into each other. Dudes are crying. I mean, it's just nonstop, right? Yeah. And it was like the physical exertion, like we were taken to a point where it was a breaking point. And I can remember thinking to myself, like, fuck, man, like I could just literally tap the fuck out right now and go home, right? And I don't know, there was kind of a mindset shift during that period where I was like, you know what, man, you said you were going to do this and you're going to fucking do it no matter what it takes. And from that point forward, I went straight through Ranger School. I passed all my patrols. And I didn't get recycled. Some guys get recycled and, they stay at whatever phase in Ranger School they're in. And then it takes an even longer amount of time. But I was with a really good group of guys. When I went through, we looked after each other, which was cool. And we all ended up graduating together. So for me, man, kind of the question that you asked about maybe some of the mental health stuff, for me, it was more about kind of at that time in my career, like some mental toughness and resiliency building. And I think, I think a lot of those experiences transcend for folks, depending on hardships they've endured, right? Throughout a certain amount of time. Well, this was just another thing that was honing and building those skills for, later on in life, essentially.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how was your ankle during Ranger School?
Not a big deal. I'd healed up. This was post a few years.
Okay,
And
so you had time to recover.
Luckily, yeah. I mean, the ankle injury, it wasn't anything catastrophic. So I healed up from that and was still able to physically perform.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that was one of my first thoughts. And my second thought was, that sounds fucking terrible.
Yeah, it was, there probably isn't enough time to describe kind of what you go through in that school, but it's tough, right? And after that, I would go through different training, and then later when I went into to Special Forces selection and everything else, and kind of comparatively, I was really happy that I attended Ranger School first, because it definitely gave me a mindset and a toughness that I didn't have previously. So when I showed up and started to do some other things in my military career, I was like, dude, I got this. You know what I mean? So
yeah, and I think that's one of the things where, like, I've kind of compared it to your, I don't want to say like your basic soldier or your basic Marine. And then like you get into Ranger or your special operations, where it's like you go through all this training and they try to fucking break you, and your body hurts, you're sleep deprived, where you're literally considering, you're like, dude, if I tap out, if you're in buds, you ring the bell 3 times and like all the pain stops, where I kind of like correlate that to, and we'll talk about this later and everything that gets into it, but I kind of correlate that to our service members and our like tier 1 operators, special operators, where it's like that suicide and ending it is your way out and ringing the bell. So that's just so we kind of get that out there. That's where my head is at. And like I mentioned before, this is the first time that we've had someone that's been through Ranger School and special operations. So like I said in the beginning, this is why I'm super excited to have this episode and be able to kind of pick your brain and talk about it.
It's, I think to your point, and I'm sure we'll talk about this here in a second, what it was like, essentially the paid entry fee to get into that. And then kind of the exclusivity of being in that brotherhood and kind of what that meant. And then, on the backside of that, why is it difficult for guys to get help, or why, guys and gals, right? But in my particular instance, all male, right? And that experience, and I've certainly seen, a variety of guys that I've served with and been around and had a lot of different experiences, whether it was addiction, suicide, and really, in the end, they're all just trying to figure it out, man. They're all just trying to figure out how to come home in their head,
So, get through Ranger School.
Yeah.
And so 2002.
Yeah, so 02 graduate Ranger School, and then basically show up to a long-range surveillance unit where I'm assistant team leader, which means I'm kind of like a second in charge of a small team of about 6 guys. Immediately forward deployed to Kuwait, and then immediately, so we had already crossed the berm, so my company was across the berm, so I was catching up with them when I got to Iraq. And I basically caught up with them, got to Baghdad, and new NCO, so I'm essentially, jumping in with this group of guys. I'm new. They're learning my personality, I'm learning theirs, and oh, by the way, we're in combat. So
there's a lot going on.
Yeah, the learning curve and the responsibility that I had. I've always considered myself pretty emotionally intelligent, and that's a situation where right away you need to be in tune and make sure that you're ready to either lead, take care of the guys, get the job done. Right, you're in combat, and so. My first deployment, I was thrust immediately into that. And not only just being in combat, but then having the responsibility of taking care of soldiers as well, right? So took all that super serious, as you should if you're a professional. And yeah, so ended up in Baghdad with the guys. And then we would end up from there being retasked to support the 101st Airborne Division. And those guys were headed up north into Mosul, which was initially a fairly peaceful area right after the invasion, but then would become fairly violent after that and would continue to be that way for a long time, given its proximity to kind of the Syrian border, and then infiltration routes in from Iran and other places, right? So a lot going on there, a lot of ethnicities up north in Iraq, with Kurds, Arabs, you know, and a lot of other people kind of influencing that area. So got up there, and it's funny, in the beginning, like I said, it was relatively peaceful. I can remember there's an Olympic pool in Mosul. And at the time, we were in what they call Ranger panties, which are like super
The short shorts.
Yeah, what do they call them now? Hoochie Daddy shorts, I think.
No, I got it.
I think it's Hoochie Daddy shorts,
no,
bro.
It's no. Fuck. I'm blanking on it right now. I'll remember it later.
Yeah.
It'll come to me. and I'll
Maybe in the
say it,
Marine Corps or the Coast Guard, you guys have a special name for short shorts.
Yeah,
but in the
Marine
Army,
Corps, we didn't wear shorts.
Yeah,
Man. We were walking
yeah.
around the barracks naked.
Just naked. Yeah. That's par for the course in the
Yeah.
Marine Corps. No, but yeah, in the Army, they were called Ranger panties. And
Yeah, that's what they are. Yeah, Ranger shorts.
Ranger panties.
Yeah.
I think the modern nomenclature now is Hoochie Daddy shorts.
Okay, that's the first I've heard of that. So
you can thank social media for me knowing that.
Yeah,
So.
seriously. So you're an E6 at this point,
Yeah.
right? Okay, and first time being a leader, first time being in charge of these guys, you're still getting used to each other.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself in combat.
Yes.
So there's a lot going on there. And you
Absolutely.
were, how old were you at that point?
Geez, I think mid-20s.
Okay.
Yeah, it was about mid-20s. So
Okay.
24, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you guys were wearing these short shorts, wandering around the Olympic pool, fucking around, having fun.
Yeah, so it's peaceful at first, and I can just remember like jumping in a Humvee and we're like, yeah, man, we're going to go swim, not a big deal. And you could tell, I could always tell though in the beginning, there was an uneasiness about what was going on, and you could like feel it with the local population, man, that like, hey man, like this peace isn't going to last very long.
Got it.
And sure enough, it didn't, and then basically an insurgency started. You had all types of different factions coming in wanting to get a piece of, killing an American. And yeah, IEDs and everything else, ambushes became prevalent, especially operating in a big city like Mosul. We found ourselves doing a lot of different things at that time. Geez, I think we got attached to what's called a Tier 1 or an SMU unit to go and do a mission with them during that time, all the way to I was doing street patrols with the 101st in Mosul, both day and night. 120 degrees in body armor and, day in, day out, basically looking for bad guys.
And at this point, you were still a Ranger?
Yeah, so basically, there's always the big delineation, right? There's the Ranger Regiment in the United States Army. And then there's Ranger School, which means you went through a school, you got qualified, you got a Ranger tab, right? So never claimed to be a Ranger is a guy that passed the school and served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. And at the time, the Army had long-range surveillance units, which had a close lineage to how the 75th Ranger Regiment was started. So essentially, those early on LRP teams in Vietnam were kind of the predecessor of the regiment, right? And so there's always this internal thing that, when guys are like, I was a Ranger, and it's like, no, man, you went to Ranger school and you got qualified. Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's guys that served in the regiment, which were actually doing that mission.
Okay, cool. So, that clears that up. Yeah. So you're still a Ranger at this point, and so then you find yourself from fucking around in a pool essentially to very shortly after
to dodging
being
IEDs,
in full kit, IEDs, and all that.
So and I during that deployment, was in a decent amount of firefights with the enemy. I was wounded that deployment inside of the city limits in Mosul. My vehicle was IED'd and took shrapnel to the legs. The explosion threw me into the roof of a vehicle I was actually driving. So it was a complex ambush initiated with IEDs. We ended up killing some bad guys in that, and luckily none of us, were killed or seriously injured. Like, I returned to duty, basically went and got cleaned up. I didn't even realize I was wounded until
the adrenaline was kicking, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. That was my first probably big gunfight.
Okay.
Up to that point, like, I some skirmishes and things like that. But that was my first big gunfight. And, that one had a lasting impact on me as well, because I remember, like, the way my senses were processing everything was like I had a sixth sense, if you will. And the way I was dialed into everything, like, the intensity level of that was significant.
Got it.
Yeah.
And that's, so on the enemy side of it, having that IED where they like kind of draw you in, and
Yeah.
granted, as we know, I've never done any of this, but I've watched videos and learned about it a little
Sure.
bit, where they got smart, where they would take out the lead vehicle with
Sure.
an IED distraction, and
Yeah.
then
then hit you from a bunch of different
left
locations.
or right
Yeah.
ambush with small arms or heavy fire,
Yeah. So
or mortars later on, essentially.
anything, right? Like a complex attack, essentially, where, they've got more than one element, that's attacking you. So this was, we were coming in from a place called Telefar, which is near the Syrian border. And this highway was known to have a lot of enemy activity on it. And I was actually in the last vehicle, and there were 3 IEDs that went off. The third one is the one that hit me. So 2, they detonated unsuccessfully, hitting the vehicles that were in front of me. And I was just the unlucky bastard that ate the third one. And, I really do credit living through that with kind of what I describe as the infancy of the insurgency, where their bomb making skills hadn't been perfected yet.
Got it.
And so, had that been a year later, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you right now, because their lethality definitely became more proficient as the war went on. Just like anything, right? We were learning, they were learning, and they were learning what our weaknesses were. And, again, if it would have happened a year after it did, I wouldn't be here talking to you probably.
Yeah.
So.
And you're lucky through that you didn't get seriously injured.
No, yeah. I mean,
so like, and what were you in, a Humvee, or what were you in?
Yeah. So I was in a soft skin Humvee, believe it or not. The impact was directly under the vehicle, underneath the engine block. And I can remember everything. And man, you want to talk about, feeling helpless. Like, I'm driving and I realize that IEDs ahead of me go off, and I accelerate. I'm like, we're going to get ambushed. Something bad is going to happen. And as an infantryman, you're like, get the fuck out of the kill zone.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, yeah, in a vehicle, it's like, get out of the kill zone. So I accelerate. Well, when I accelerate, we go right over the last IED. And so this thing goes off, right? Like, it throws me into the top of the vehicle, completely. I mean, at that point, I maintain control of the vehicle, and it drifts to a stop. And, of course, my ears are ringing. I had been thrown into the top of the vehicle, pretty big explosion. At the time, I didn't realize, but shrapnel had come through the floorboard and hit me in the legs. And I didn't know any of this. Well, then the vehicle catches on fire. The guy behind me essentially gets burnt, 3rd-degree burns up his arm. We're all kind of dazed and confused. I've got one of my young guys riding shotgun with me. And at that time, I think First Sergeant Murphy was riding in my vehicle.
Okay.
And so we, I remember bailing out of the vehicle. And kind of a funny thing that happens during this gunfight, like my first significant one, is one of my guys, Private Foster from Alabama. I'll never forget him. Absolute, stud. And he's got a saw, which is a squad automatic weapon. So he's got a machine gun. And he jumps out of the Humvee, right? And we're getting hit from one side. So they've got different ambush points that they've set up. And they're trying to shoot us and everything else. And it's crazy. There's civilians out in the street. Just mass chaos, right? And he comes running around the side of the Humvee. I'm out now and have kind of my wits about me, at first dazed and confused, but I look up and I see his head snap back as he rounds the vehicle. Well, he had left the hand mic hooked to his Kevlar helmet that was attached to a radio inside the vehicle, and it like snapped him back.
Oh, fuck. So it ripped him.
Yeah, it ripped him back. And he's like, God damn, you know, with this country
With his
accent.
accent.
Yeah. And so he rips this hand mic out of his helmet, right? And then basically I'm telling him at the time, like, hey man, go to work with that machine gun. Like we're getting shot at, you know?
Yeah.
And he does, right? And, you know, there was a lot of really cool things that happened that day when you talk about taking care of each other. And, you know, it's crazy because we were all on the street fighting, and the guys that made it out of the kill zone initially fought their way back into the kill zone because they knew that our vehicle got hit, and they came back to get us, right?
And you were last.
I was the last vehicle.
Right? So
we were the unlucky bastards that were still stuck in the kill zone getting tuned up by the bad guys.
Yeah.
So, but, you know, I worked with some really amazing guys back then as well. And those guys were like, hey, man, you know, never leave a fallen comrade mentality. And, you know, they maneuvered their way back in, fought their way back to us, and then came and got us out of the kill zone. And in the course of that, a couple bad guys that had maneuvered relatively close, and, you know, we were able to eliminate them and then, and then get out of there. And then it wasn't until after that, you know, of course I was thrown into the vehicle and everything else. The top of the vehicle hurt my neck and my head and everything else. But I was, you know, the guys are like checking us over, right? Because they're like, hey, are you okay?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know he's burnt pretty bad, you know, up his arm. And they were like, hey, Kurt, you're bleeding. And so I looked down at my desert camis, and they were covered in blood, you know, basically like from mid-thigh down. And I was like, what the fuck? I'm like, holy shit, man, I'm fucking hit. And, you know, so we pull my pants down quick to see like what's the nature of the injuries, right? To make sure like my femoral hadn't been hit or anything like that.
That's where my first thought, probably your first thought too, when you saw that.
Yeah. It's like a major one, right? Like if you're hit there, like you're going to die fast. So yeah. And basically, so we're checking there, everybody's checking me out real quick. And it's like, oh man, you just got peppered with shrapnel in your legs, right? So I'd been wounded, but it wasn't anything catastrophic. So basically, you know, we head back and just kind of like process everything. Of course, everybody else in the unit's like, holy fuck, man, like our guys got ambushed and, you know, it was a big gunfight and all this shit, right? So there was like part of this that went along with it too, was like, you know, we were some of the first guys in the company to really get into it. And so there was kind of a badge of honor that went along with that as well.
Yeah.
So
the unlucky badge of honor that you were fucking gotten.
Yeah. So, but that was, you know, that was cool.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah, that was
with
cool.
Your peers.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's like, what was it like, man? You know, and you guys are getting after it.
So that's one of the things that you train for, right? Because you do all this training and you're like, and you mentioned it earlier too, where it's like you put all this training that you go through, you the real test is putting it to work in combat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And that's that's what you look for.
Yeah. The culmination of the exercise is doing it, you know, for real.
Yeah. And so that's kind of one of the things that I will probably always, for the rest of my life, I'll always wonder what it felt like to be the unlucky bastard. Not saying that I want to get blown up by an ID, but
yeah, but you still are involved in a profession where that can happen at any time. You know?
Well, true. That's the first responder side of it, where who knows who the fuck's gonna be starting playing IEDs out there. But as far as like the military side of things go, like you joined the Marine Corps infantry originally. The same thing like your what your pops went through, your grandfather, where someone had to sign because he was 17.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So my mom signed for me, and she was like, "What the fuck am I getting into?" As she's putting her name down. But for me, growing up watching like Black Hawk Down, Behind Enemy Lines, all this stuff, like I don't know if it's like fucked up with me, but like I wanted to go and I wanted to do some fucking damage. I wanted to go serve my country.
Of course.
But I will probably I will live with the unknown of being like, what did that feel like? Like I never got to use all the training, and like you have to have that mindset where it's like this could happen one day, which you talked about. But you do all this training and you always think that, and then it doesn't happen, which kind of like you kind of got blue balls, you know, for like your entire time of service.
And nobody wants blue balls.
Nobody likes blue balls, but 7.5 years, I'm gonna have blue balls for the rest of my life, and in that sense, essentially. But I think the switch for you guys from going in Ranger panties in the pool and fucking around to okay, now we're going on
Yeah.
patrols.
Everything.
And then the extra
Yeah.
switch to, hey, I just got fucked up in an IED blast.
Yeah.
And like, you're the first one. So it's like, hey, this is real.
Yeah, absolutely, man. From that point forward, and I certainly, through the rest of my career, anytime I jumped in a military vehicle and I was downrange, I was always like, I fucking hate this. Because
that is literally fucking complex post-traumatic stress. That is trauma from your first one. Like, that is literally the perfect. We're going to use this for like the headline of talk. Like, this is trauma. Every time after this, you got into a vehicle and you thought about it every single time.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I experienced a lot on my first deployment. So I was also involved in what they call a mass casualty.
Yeah.
Which, this one in particular, a lot of guys hurt, a couple guys dead.
Your guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I was involved in all of that. And in a weird way, like, that one hurts a lot. Like I've done some other podcasts and talked about that a little bit through some other engagements, that I had and what I was doing professionally at the time. But that one in particular kind of definitely left a mark. And that one for me, it seemed like such a waste. I mean, essentially, and I'll kind of lay it out for you. And I'm sure that if you're listening or, if you're listening, you'll understand. But we ended up, we were up in Mosul, like I talked about. And at the time, we were attached to the 101st Airborne Division. So essentially, we weren't with our main element, right? We were up north away from them. And, the military being the way that it is, they have change of commands. And, that's when a new commander comes in and the outgoing commander, right? They all pat each other on the back. And essentially, there's a formal ceremony that takes place where that new officer or enlisted leader is now taking formal responsibility of a unit, right? Well, that was going on with our main unit, which was down in a place called Tikrit, which, if you know anything about Iraq at the time, was not a nice place to be either. So we had to jump into our vehicles and head several hours south to head to this chain of command because basically, the powers that be at the time wanted representation from our unit there, right?
Of course. So, and you're standing at position of attention at 100 degrees, 120,
exactly.
trying not to pass the fuck out.
All the shit that
fun.
Basically that was a catalyst for me leaving the regular army was some of these experiences, right? So anyways, we end up, in this large convoy, right? And at the time we're driving Humvees, and then the Army had these other vehicles called LMTVs, which are like big trucks that can fit a bunch of guys in them, right? So we're in a vehicle convoy, which is essentially a big group of vehicles going down the highway. And, there was a lot of damage to the roads in Iraq at the time because we had bombed the shit out of them and everything else, right? So infrastructure was still jacked up in the country, right? This is just after the invasion. Essentially, this is, post-invasion occupation type of stuff or whatever you want to call it, right? We're trying to then start, security operations and nation building and everything else, right? So, but everything hadn't been repaired or fixed to include the roads, right? So we get going, and several hours into this drive, basically a terrible sand and rainstorm come through, and the visibility was like nothing, right? We couldn't see. So the convoy pulled over to the side of the road, right? Because that's the safe thing to do, because none of us could see. And of course, the storm passed, right? We buttoned up all the vehicles and the storm passed. And we get back out onto the highway after the storm passed and start to drive again. Well, the lead vehicle at the time, he's hustling, right, doing 60, 70 miles an hour or something like that, and doesn't see a bomb crater in the road out ahead of him. And basically hits the brakes and causes this chain reaction for the entire convoy.
Yeah.
And when he does that, some of the other drivers, again, it's a long drive. I think, maybe some guys weren't paying attention. It caused a chain reaction, causes one of the LMTVs, which is a large troop carrier right in front of me, to then slam its brakes on and go sliding on the highway. And basically the vehicle did a 180, if you can imagine that, and the vehicle hits the dirt, and then it flips about 3 or 4 times, and this is full of guys in the back. And I just remember I was driving our Humvee at the time. I had our small LURS team with us. My team lead at the time, which is a guy named Adrian Elizalde, who unfortunately later on would go to Special Forces and get killed in Iraq. But he and I were together, and good guys in the back. One of our guys was a former Ranger Regiment guy, and then he had worked on an ambulance as a paramedic. When he got out of the Army, when 9/11 happened, he came back in.
Got it.
And so, highly trained first responder, right? And so obviously he was our team medic, right? So, and a couple of my young guys back there with us, and we see this vehicle slide off the road, flip. Guys are flying, equipment's flying, and at that moment, I was like, this is going to be bad, like really bad. So I basically am driving the Humvee and kind of following the wreckage, making sure that I don't run anybody over or anything else, bring the vehicle to a stop, a stop. And we immediately jump out of the vehicle and start to help dudes. There were, I think, 2 guys. There were 2 guys that were trapped underneath the vehicle, several guys with them. These guys were sitting towards the rear of the LMTV, and essentially they were folded in half underneath the vehicle. So myself, my team leader at the time, Adrian, we're digging underneath the back of the truck. There was a guy pinned under the back who had a broken pelvis. So, I mean, there were guys everywhere. I'm talking shattered femurs, broken backs. One guy had his chest cavity collapsed. Horrific, right?
Yeah, just totally worst case scenario for a convoy going to a chain of command ceremony.
Exactly. And catastrophic accident with a troop carrier, and now guys are either dead, wounded, all broken up. I mean, I remember guys crying for their moms, like really, really tough stuff, right? So all I could think about then was like help as many guys as you can. Yeah. And I remember sitting with the guy that was pinned under the back of the LMTV, and he actually gave me his wedding ring at the time. He was married and was like, hey man, if I don't make it, like, please make sure my wife gets this wedding ring, So like serious, life-changing type experiences.
Yeah.
And that one for me was, I think, probably one that makes me, sad when I think about that, because, 3 guys ended up dying out of that. And it was like, for what, man? You know what I mean? It was almost like, had we been in a gunfight, I could
kind of accept it a little bit.
Yeah, but the formality of the military and some of the silliness that the regular military still wanted to do, it just didn't sit well with me. And I can remember after that kind of making a decision. And I had some other experiences in that deployment where we did work with special operations and we were attached with them. And I was like, when I get back, that's what I'm doing.
Got
like 110%. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. And not only like stopping the vehicle, getting out, and like if you were to here, like on Highway 1, right? And right next to the water, like if you saw a multi-vehicle collision, and you pull over to the shoulder and you get out and you can go run over to the people and be like, hey, are you okay? Blah, blah, blah. Sure. Like you still have to worry about insurgents in the area. Right. Exactly. You still have to worry about IEDs.
Yeah.
So there's like so much more going on to that. And then completely get where you're at from my point of view of like, hey, we have this big change of command ceremony. We're going to fluff it up, blah, blah, blah. But we want some representation from you guys. So we need you guys here at this time. And you're like, for what?
Yeah, exactly.
We lost so many of these guys. So the soldier that gave you the ring that was pinned, did he make it or
he
not?
did?
He did.
Yeah. So his name was John Eisenberg. He ended up going to 7th Special Forces Group, where he would later, I believe he retired out of there. I lost contact with him, but he ended up having a pretty catastrophic injury. So he's medevaced all the way back home, broken pelvis, and ended up recovering from that and actually coming back.
That's fucking impressive.
Yeah,
exactly. That alone.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I was very fortunate to have served in F Company 51st with a lot of really great guys. A lot of guys would leave that company and go on and be really impactful guys in their own right in special operations after that. So it was a really great group of guys to serve with, and I was really proud of that. One of the other kind of small parts of that whole, mass casualty thing was because that storm had just come through, the helicopters weren't flying to medevac. So, there were guys that, that we sat on for hours, at a casualty collection point, like you do in the military when something big and bad happens, you know what I mean? Like there's still an organized process to everything where you're essentially, you're looking at guys evaluating their injuries, who has to be medevac first, right? And you're going
for your
down
line,
exactly
who's priority, who's urgent, who's
exactly. And there was one guy, two of the guys were dead right away. And I remember helping carry one of those guys and putting a poncho over him and carrying him out to a casualty collection point. And then there was another guy, Specialist Gleason, who was still alive. And unfortunately, because, we couldn't get a medevac to get him to a higher level of care, he ended up passing later on. We did get him on a bird eventually. And he went to, back to basically an emergency, military hospital type of deal. A cache is what it's called. And I remember getting the call that night. I was sitting with the guys that I was on my team with on that long range surveillance team, and I remember the guy Mike Kirby, who was the medic on my team, and we were sitting there next to each other. And we got the call over SATCOM that Gleason didn't make it. And he was the guy that everybody was, to include Mike, were working on to try to save. And, of course, we got the call that night. And I just remember Mike, breaking down. And we were all emotional. You know what I mean? It hurts to lose guys that you care about. And it was tough to see all that. So no doubt that was an impactful. Again, this is my first combat deployment and, multiple gunfights but hey, that's, essentially what you signed up for. And I think my other realization in it was, is that, bad things happen, and bad things happen to good people, bad things happen in general. And, you just do the best you can to manage the situation at the time and make sure that you do the best you can to take care of people.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I know it's like every time you kind of talk about it, and that's why it's difficult to talk about these things and go to therapy and discuss stuff that you have a hard time talking with, because you kind of put yourself back in that place and you relive it.
Yeah.
Which a lot of us in the military and first responder do, because this was your first combat deployment.
Yep.
And you've already been blown up.
Yeah.
And then you go to a stupid fucking change of command ceremony where you don't want to go to.
Yeah.
And you're essentially getting forced to, where you're just going to stand in the back of a formation and wait till it's fucking over. And then this happens, which is like obviously a huge trauma to you, to your medic, to the families,
right,
to essentially the entire unit and everybody that knew the ones that were seriously injured that were brought back to the States or that were killed. And thinking about it from like a trauma and mental health like a position.
Oh yeah.
Like your first combat deployment, and I'm sure there's more that's in between that we've talked about, but from you getting injured in an IED blast, being the last vehicle, and seeing your buddy run over with the saw and get his head almost fucking ripped off with their fucking radio. Yeah. And then to go into this where it's just like essentially like a normal vehicle collision, kind of.
Sure.
But you also have to worry about a potential ambush, IEDs. Yeah. And then I can only imagine the frustration of like sending up a 9-liner trying to get a bird to come in to do a medevac, where they're like, hey, we can't because of weather conditions.
Yeah.
And as you're sitting on scene, watching these people, and you're getting handed over a wedding ring, and is like, if I don't make it, please make sure this gets. And it's like, that's the type of shit that, like, in my eyes, you only see on movies.
Right.
But for you and so many other service members out there, this was just another day in Iraq, or another day in Afghanistan in combat, where it's like all of these traumas, they just compound and compound on each other, where like what is the military doing with our infantrymen and our special operators, where you go through a trauma like getting blown up in an IED and then being in a firefight, or the simple mass casualty going to a change of command ceremony. Like during those two times, were there any after actions? I'm sure there were, but were there any like, hey, we're going to have you sit down and talk to a mental health clinician, or have a fucking debrief for 30 minutes one-on-one with this person? She or he's going to talk you through the situation.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is we went back to Mosul after, we kept the scene safe, obviously, secured all the equipment, the vehicles, everything else, got everybody out of there that had been, injured. And then we went back to Mosul, and I'll never forget this, like a lot of other things, some things I have forgotten. But we get back up there, and I First Sergeant Murphy, again, I have, the utmost respect for him, because this guy, was a 75th Ranger Regiment guy, had jumped into Panama in combat. He had been in combat already. You know what I mean? He knew that bad and dangerous things happen when young men go to war. And basically, I remember him walking in. He brought all of us in that were at the crash site. And he said, guys, he's like, if you do this long enough, he's like, you're going to see stuff like this. And he said, and if you stay, again, if you do this for a long time, you're going to see more. He's like, this isn't the end of, of things that will happen. And then, he basically emphasized how important it was to take care of each other. And that was really impactful at that time. And then he also opened it up and said, hey, there's a chaplain available. If you need to talk to someone, he's like, we'll get you to where you need to be to talk to someone to be able to process what's gone on. And, I appreciated that, but I wasn't ready to talk about that. You know what I mean? And I think I process some of the things that I've been through my own way. And part of doing that is also doing some of these, right? Coming on to a podcast and talking about some of those experiences. And that's a way for me to process and kind of decompress a bit from that stuff. But yeah, to answer your question, yeah, he came in like a good leader does and make sure that his guys are okay. And we were all young. And I certainly at that time didn't know how impactful that would be, because we were still in country and the enemy was still there. And we were still going out, we were still dealing with firefights and everything else. And, I think the prevailing feeling at the time was like, hey man, like we want to make it home, and we need to stay sharp. And so your mind is completely engaged that way. And, and because I stayed in the military after that, and I'm sure we'll talk about soon, but me leaving and going to SF, the totality of my experiences didn't come to a head until I left the military. And then, there was a weird replay of almost 20 years on active duty, and that was weird.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're not alone with that, and that's why.
Yeah,
and we'll talk about that later with the retired community and the transition from being active duty and experiencing all of these traumas to one day you're like, okay, my contract's up, I get my DD 214, and now I'm out on my own, and I'm not with my guys, I'm not with and we'll talk about all that.
Yeah,
and it's
that is a unique thing as well.
It's a huge shift for our entire military community and also the first responder community, where as like when you do hit that retired status, you're not constantly around your guys. You're not constantly getting checked on by the guys that you can actually like open up to, that understand what you go through or have been through.
It's that transition piece, right?
It's tough.
Like and obviously, I would never take away from anybody that, does an enlistment and then, transitions out or anything else. But I think through my experience, the amount of time that transition was pretty significant. And I know, depending on your experiences, though, that transition can be difficult regardless of time and service, but I think we should expect there being a difficult transition, especially with folks that, that do, essentially you're institutionalized and you're surrounded by people, that have experienced similar things. And so a lot of times it's weird. You're like in an echo chamber. So I can just imagine, civilians listening in on a conversation inside of a special forces team room being mortified,
Yeah.
by
And so like I explain it as like it's like you have a therapist or psychologist, whatever, that doesn't know, right? That is essentially put him or her in a room with special forces dude that have been through all of this. And like the iPhone emoji where it's like the eyes open, where you're like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, that's why it's so important for our entire community to have like therapists and whoever can help you. It doesn't matter.
Sure.
But they need to be competent or informed. They need to know what you go through so that you can open up and talk about whatever and like get into those gruesome details that are still playing in your head.
Sure.
And that person that's sitting in the chair across from you is like, okay, and how, and like reacts normally where it doesn't make you feel like, wow, oh my God, I am fucked up. Like
I don't kind of have a different perspective about all of it. And it's not, I look at things and I don't think I'm fucked up. I just think I'm a product of all these experiences that, that I went through, whether it was in combat or training or anything else, because of what I chose to do, which is an important distinction to make. I chose to do those things. And along with that, came a significant amount of danger and everything else. But that was part of the I don't know, of what attracted me to it. You know what I mean? It was like, you're doing something where you're getting paid to like blow shit up, shoot, fucking jump out of airplanes, fucking live life on the edge, right? And so for me, that was, incredibly exciting and I loved it, And so for me, part of it also, in listening to other guys that I look up to that have transitioned out of the military is, a realization that when you send young men and women off to war and you do that for a long time and, you send professional soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen off to war, that there is an expectation that that person is going to come back different. So, you hear a lot of folks in the veteran community. I certainly am not a victim. I don't look at things in a way where I say, oh, poor me. I chose to do that job and I continued to choose doing the job because I loved it and I loved the people that I was around.
Yeah.
But we would be naive to expect our folks coming back from fighting war to not be changed, right? And so I have some mentors myself and guys that I've looked up to that have described things that way, and that really resonated with me, right? Because it was like, hey man, I chose to do this. Some of those experiences were traumatic. Those are going to have an effect on me. And I just do my best to try to understand those and process those to make sure that they don't put me in a place that, that would be a bad place.
Yeah. And I think that's a super important topic, is where it's like, you have to allow yourself to process those and to not get kind of like held up and to kind of move on, but not like to move on right away where you completely like put it behind you and then you have to deal with that shit later on. But like do an after action with a team, do a debrief, speak to someone, chaplain, whatever it may be, get your mind kind of straight and then go on. Because I can imagine after the mass casualty with the convoy going to the chain of command, where you had a lot of anger going on, right?
Sure.
And it's like the same thing with the one where you were involved in the IED. Like you have so much anger where the last thing that you probably want to do is be like, let's sit down, everybody, and get in a circle and
I think
have your Zen moment and talk about your feelings. You just want to be like, okay,
not.
fuck them. Like, let's go out, let's punch out again and go.
Absolutely. I mean, the drive then was, aggression and, everything else that comes along with that. Obviously with the vehicle accident, tragic.
Yeah.
absolute waste in my opinion, which that hit really hard that way. I think for me, I think looking back on a lot of different experiences, one of the things that you just brought up with kind of having a little debrief, or certainly like on a tactical level, we always were doing AARs and stuff like that. Hey, what can we do better? What did we screw up? Yada, 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 right? That was normal. But on a mental health level, like identifying some things and then making sure that, you know, if guys are having some issues with it, that the resources are available. You know, I think that's a wise thing that to the best of my knowledge now happens a lot more often. Just because, you know, we've had so many veterans and folks take their lives, that more of those type of things are being put in place, you know, to help people out. So again, I think my experience was you compartmentalize a lot of shit. You know what I mean? And I'm like a fucking professional at doing that, by the way.
I'm sure a lot of people at your caliber and with all your training are probably like that.
I mean, it's
because that's how you're taught, right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, you know, and when you're still going and you have a responsibility to other people around you, you know, you don't have time to to allow other things to creep in, right? Like the mission continues. And so,
yeah,
you know, that's cool until you leave.
Yeah. And so a whole different topic that we haven't even really touched on here is family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and this can go on and on and on, talking about your first fucking combat deployment. Like, I have so many questions and so many things I want to bring up, but like, could be
we should talk about family.
Sitting here until dinner. So, obviously, some of those soldiers that you were with on your team at the time, or you were attached to, were married, engaged, had a significant other, had kids, and I know you mentioned one handed a ring to you, and you were like, "Oh my God, if he dies, I have to be responsible to get this to his wife," and like that's a huge burden that not many people go through even once in their entire life, which is very traumatic. But like maybe touch on the family side of things, where your first deployment overseas, where things are kind of relaxed a little bit, but you know things are going to go south, and how talking to the families were at that point and relationships, and then shit hits the fan. Like, okay, you call home. Oh, we had our first incident. So maybe if you could just touch on like family aspect of your first deployment.
So I was married first off, I was married for almost 20 years. I have 3 children. My son is my oldest, and I've got 2 daughters. So Christian, Cameron, and Emma. And yeah, my you know, combat deployments and that lifestyle certainly affect your family in a lot of different ways. Like I said about compartmentalizing, I feel like I'm a professional at doing it. I did everything I possibly could to shield my family from a lot of shit that I was going through and the things that I experienced, but I did that intentionally. Because I never wanted them to be scared or worried about me.
That is the common theme right there amongst all military and first responders.
Here's kind of a fucked up deal that happened when I got wounded. Word had reached back to my wife at the time that I was wounded and I lost my leg. So you can imagine for her, that was a pretty traumatic phone call to receive. Or I'm not sure at that time if someone from the unit drove to the house to talk to her, or how that worked. I don't recall that part, but I do remember her saying, yeah, like initially they told me you lost your leg. And I'm like, what? Like, how fucked up is that? You know what I mean? And then, you know, you talked about communication with families. At that time, you know, we were still writing letters. And then I think by about halfway through 2003, we had gotten email. And so I can remember like some trailers being set up with computers, and then you could send an email home. And so that's how I was communicating with my spouse at the time. And then my kids were growing up. So my son, I had with someone else, and he was older and lived with her at the time. And then my daughters I had with my wife. And so when I left for Iraq, my daughter Cameron was 9 months old. Emma hadn't been born yet, but she was 9 months old. And when I came back from Iraq, she was almost 2. So I'll never forget coming home and feeling what that was like. She looked at me like she had no idea who I was.
Yeah, and which has to be super difficult to.
Yeah.
And you talk about compartmentalizing, like you have a 9-month-old, and then she was pregnant with.
No, not yet with Emma.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah. But they're 4 years apart. So
okay, got
not
it.
Quite yet.
So while you're dealing with everything, all this trauma and everything, you're trying to shield them, but also like there had to be a part of you that knew you were going to go back home, and it was going to be like, okay, what's my 2-year-old going to think of me? How's this going to go?
It was weird, man. Like at that time, there wasn't like any kind of professional reintegration training. It was like I came home, like there they were at a place called Green Ramp at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. I show up, my kid's looking at me like I have a dick growing out of my forehead.
Who the fuck are you?
Yeah, like, what? Like, who are you? Like, why do you want to, and I was trying to pick her up and hold her.
Got it. Yeah.
And so that was, impactful. But honestly, I never worried about that. I've always loved my kids and always been affectionate with them. And so quickly, getting back, she warmed up to me pretty fast, and, Dad was there and it was cool. So, but certainly an experience, and, one that, again, I can remember really well, because it was like, whoa, man, that's impactful. Right. And then, just reintegrating with a spouse, man. I've been gone a long time and experienced a lot of different things. And, I certainly would never claim to be the best husband ever. And I had my own shit that I was working through, but I was able to reintegrate back into my family. But all the different stressors that it brings to family, when you're gone, you come back, you're gone, you come back, the spouse, one of the spouses is like, does things and operates their way. And then you show back up and essentially, try to reinsert yourself in that. And I was never, to be quite honest, I was never really good at kind of paying attention to how she was running the show. I would come back in and be like, all right, I'm back. We'll run it my way.
Yeah,
which obviously
type A personality where it's like, all right, cool.
She probably wouldn't laugh if she heard this, but
it's true. It's
yeah.
That's kind of because you're so used to running things, and when you run your own team overseas, or you run and you're in charge, it's so difficult for. I can imagine from coming back in such a serious environment to, okay, hey, honey, how are you doing things back with the kids? What is their schedule like? How can I reintegrate? How can I make this a seamless transition?
Yeah.
I don't think any of that really happens. It's kind of just like, hey, I'm back. Here we go.
If there was a piece of advice that I can give in this to anybody that's on active duty and you are, married or with a significant other and you have kids and everything else, I think it's important to recognize that. Again, learn through my mistakes, don't make the same ones type of deal. It's obviously important, to be in tune with kind of what your spouse is doing and what they have going on, especially if you don't want friction. And, when you come in and try to change everything, that causes friction, which isn't going to help for your reintegration.
Yeah, no, it's only making it harder when back in your time, you didn't have that reintegration training.
Yeah.
And so we got that. So when I was in Japan in 2019, when we came back, and granted the trauma that I had was they ran out of fucking salmon nigiri. Like salmon nigiri and sake's out. You got to go to the next sushi
I'm feeling
spot.
real sad for you right now, Greg.
So that was my trauma. But all joking aside, like when we got back, we had a reintegration training back to civilian side of things. We had to make our own resumes. The guys that had like real jobs helped the younger Marines that didn't have jobs. We did like mock oral board interviews for fire departments, police departments.
Yeah.
And then we talked about like reintegration back into families and if they had kids and all that, which was great.
Yeah.
And then also resources for like therapy for your family and everything too. So it's kind of cool to see like
the progression, right?
Exactly.
Like that early on, that wasn't happening. Later on in my military career, there was a lot more support there. And then also being in special operations, the support network there, was a healthy one. It wasn't perfect.
Okay. Yeah.
But there was definitely more there if you needed help.
Yeah.
So
And that's one of the big things that I want to jump into here in a little bit. But you mentioned shielding everything that was going on from your family,
sure,
from your kids, from your spouse. And as you can imagine, I'm sure at one point or another, if you're listening to this, if you're an active duty service member, you're a first responder, there has been a time in your career where you have shielded your kids, your wife, your husband, whatever it may be, from the shit that's going on.
yeah,
Which is, I think it kind of stems from that mindset and that training where it's like, let's like take care of everybody else. Like we don't want to put that trauma on them or make them worry.
sure,
But then it's kind of a catch-22 because when I come home from work and I'm kind of off or I'm kind of fucked up maybe from a traumatic call, or there's been a series of traumatic calls for service or incidents on a deployment where it's like, oh, everything's fine. And then things are different.
yeah.
So it's difficult. And I think that's one of the tough things for our community.
Yeah, I think certainly training for families and kind of understanding a deeper understanding of what happens on the job would probably be helpful, right? And I'm sure, again, I've been out of the military now for 5, 6 years, something like that. And I'm sure that, there were a lot of lessons learned through a lot of really tragic things that have happened, post-service or, retirement for LE or folks leave or whatever, right? And, one of those things that stands out to me would be more training for families to help understand kind of what the service member or, the first responder is experiencing, and that, you don't, it shouldn't necessarily, what I'm not saying is it's not a free pass for misbehavior if there's like weird stuff going on, and that person needs help or it needs to be addressed, but also, essentially teaching people how to be empathetic, or to have, more empathy, and then kind of describing what that person might be going through. And then also just saying like, hey, you might have to be patient. Because these jobs do take their toll on people. And of course, this, depending on what your capacity is for what I call taking on a lot of shit, people have different thresholds, and that puts people in different headspaces, right? And I always felt pretty fortunate that the things that I experienced, like I said, I was good at compartmentalizing. And, there are things that I could certainly do better for myself even now. But I think for the most part, I've done the best I can to have a healthy transition, out into the civilian world, if you will.
Yeah. And I think that's, and it's important to touch on. I'm glad that I don't know what sparked me to talk about the family aspect there, but
the family aspect is huge. They're your support network.
It's super important because there's like you compartmentalize, you shield them, and the transition back, you're a different person and you haven't really talked about it. They haven't really received much support, and that's literally a contributing factor to why our divorce rate amongst military and first responders is like 50%.
Yeah, it's not good.
And then you have you tack on a service member that's been through multiple incidents, mass casualty incidents, IEDs, gunfights, seen fucked up shit.
Yeah.
Comes home, gets divorced, and then it's like, okay, you deal with the whole divorce process.
Yep.
And then if you have kids, then it's like, I don't want my kids around you. Then you're going to court and shit just starts to go downhill. And that's where I feel like in our military community, especially, that's like a very common theme.
Yeah. I mean, any of that, like if you, like all the things you just listed off, if you can imagine someone kind of stacking all that shit together, like that's a lot of shit to go through. You know what I mean? And especially like if you're not, if you're not like in tip top, like mental health shape, if you will. And, I mean, there's a reason why, people kill themselves, and I'm not saying that I agree with that. I have my own opinion about that, but I also am empathetic because it's like, you know, in my mind, it's a way for them to escape, you know, and it's a way, you know, to get away from everything, which, you know, I don't agree with. So I'll say that now. And you know, my opinion about it is like, if you're at that point, like, I don't care. I don't care who you are, like, reach out to somebody for help. You know what I mean? Like, nothing, even all that shit stacked up, like the people that you're going to leave behind and what that does to people and your children and everything else. And I realize, like, you know, that, you know, I've heard before that when people get to that point, like, those aren't the things that they're thinking about, which obviously if they were, you know, it may sway their decision in another direction. You know, but if there's any way to kind of, you know, not think about what's affecting you and think about all the people that you're going to leave behind that love you and the legacy that leaves those people. Yeah, that's, I don't know, man, like, that's impactful for me, you know? So, and I've certainly, you know, being out of the community of folks that I was in, I've seen a lot of different things, you know, and I've seen everything from suicide to addiction. I think I mentioned this earlier, but, you know, all those things together, man, and how they tear people apart. It's, yeah, it's pretty shitty.
Yeah, it's tough. And so I did an episode with Scott Howell from Ironside's podcast, and I said something on there where it was similar, like every single first responder or service member knows someone who has died by
Yeah,
suicide,
absolutely.
essentially.
Yeah.
And it's, when you think about it, like if you put us up against like maybe your normal Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 job behind a desk, like
Sure.
you can pretty confidently, unfortunately, say that our community knows someone or a few people who've died by suicide, whether active or retired, where
Right.
maybe not the other side of things.
Sure.
And it stems from, I think, the training that we go through, right? So like your normal basic training, you're taught to not show weakness, not show emotion. They're supposed to break you down and then build you back up how they want you. And then for you, basic training did that. All right, welcome to the United States military. We're going to break you down. We're going to fuck with you. We're going to totally destroy you. And then we're going to rebuild you.
Right.
And then you go to the next tier, which is Ranger School, where you mentioned earlier, where they're literally doing whatever they can to get you to your breaking point to where you ring the bell.
Yeah.
And through Ranger School or for the SEAL community buds, there are people that break.
Oh, absolutely.
And essentially suicide is like that breaking point, in my opinion, where you're like, okay, I cannot do this.
Yeah, the one tap out you can't come back from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's crazy to, like, I've thought about it for so long that we have so many suicides amongst the military community. And like, I'd be curious to look at the stats to see like if it was like a special operations community member, or just kind of like your basic infantryman, whatever the case may be. Because, and I think this is a perfect kind of segue into you getting into special operations, and talking about the difference between the mental health availability and the resources there. Comparing to, as you mentioned earlier, like the basic Army.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the segue into my special operations career. So I leave Iraq, redeployed to the United States in 2004. So I spent just shy of a year there, deployment. Came back to the United States and I was like, hey man, I worked with I worked with the SF team. I worked with a tier 1 SMU, special missions unit, you know, experienced all these cool things. And I was like, I want to go be an SF guy. So I come back right away from Iraq. I go to a special operations recruiter, sign up, get a date to what's called SFAS, which is Special Forces Assessment and Selection. I was in great physical shape at the time, wasn't worried about that. And I was just like, hey man, I'm all in, like, let's do this. trying to think. I want to say probably the summer of 2004. I attended Special Forces Assessment and Selection at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, actually out at Camp McCall, which is a kind of a subset of Fort Bragg, if you will, in the North Carolina area near Fort Bragg. And went through selection there and jumped into it and got selected. And
what's that process like?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot that goes into it where they look at your military resume. Yeah. Do you have to do an interview with them? Do they look at your...
I think...
how does all that work?
What was the screening process back then? I think you had to do a psychological exam initially. Don't hold me to that. I cannot remember that for sure, but I'm pretty sure that we ended up doing that. Of course, later on, you do your security clearance stuff and everything else. But and then through different things, when I was in special operations, there's more psychological things and exams and things of that nature. But the big part about selection was individually in the beginning, it's a bunch of individual physical events. So they're seeing if you're physically fit. And if you can, essentially orienteer and do a series of other things. And then, after you demonstrate those things, then you do things as a team member and they evaluate, how you're going to be on a team. For me, the experience itself wasn't the hardest one I had been through. I jokingly compare Ranger School and SFAS, and I'm always like, Ranger School was 10 times harder for me.
Okay.
SFAS, it was what I was looking for. It was a professional approach to what I was looking for in the military, which was, hey, essentially big boy rules. Like, I don't need anybody looking over my shoulder telling me what to do all the time. In selection, there's a dry erase board that they set up on the outside in this big quad area at the time, and they put a timeline on there, and they write all the instructions there. Nobody comes and holds your hand and says, "Hey, private, get your ass up, like we're going to do X."
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's the beginning of, the expectation is that, hey, you're a professional, right? And that there are going to be times, if you make it through this, where someone is not going to be looking over your shoulder. You're going to be given some of the more sensitive things to do for your country, and you're going to have to navigate your way through that, successfully without anybody holding your hand.
Yeah.
And so that for me was impactful right off the bat. I was like, yes, perfect.
And that's cool because because I feel like at that point in your career where you've already done one deployment overseas as a leader, and you're kind of like, okay, I can ensure that the guys get to the chow hall or to the fucking PT field or the pool at 0645, whatever the case may be.
In reality, like leading guys in combat and having already done that and then going there was just another resiliency builder to continue on in this, this kind of quest that I had to be the ultimate professional soldier, if you will.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so how long was that selection process?
I think at that time you're looking at roughly, I think it was like 2 to 3 weeks. And I'd have to go back to look at exactly what the time frame is. But yeah, so individual events into essentially team events. And then there's a large part of that that's orienteering. It's called the STAR land navigation course. And that attrits a lot of people. And then from what I saw, like self-selecting and quitting is what got a lot of people. And it was crazy too. Like, you stayed in these, essentially these, what they called B huts, right? That had a bunch of bunk beds in it. And it's full of guys in the beginning. You know what I mean? Everybody's in there, but you notice every morning you wake up, like the herd is thinning.
And there's one less.
And guys, it's funny. I feel like in the middle of the night, dudes like quit. You know what I mean? It's, use the analogy a couple times about whatever buds or, SEAL training, and guys ring the bell in front of everybody. And in SFAS, it's a little bit different experience where dudes, you don't see a lot of guys quit while you're doing the events, but in the middle of the night, guys pack their shit and leave.
Because you're probably, and this is just my first thought of it, where when you're in the middle of the events, you're so fucking occupied on the mission first. Okay, this is what I got to do, and then it's like, oh, 6 hours until our next one. That's time to think. That's where
exactly.
you sit
I'm sure. I was never an SFAS cadre, because guys can, eventually you can go back to the schoolhouse and instruct and everything.
Yeah.
And, but the psychology behind it is, there are periods of downtime.
And that's on purpose, the mind games to play, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would assume that's what that's built for. It's also, again, you get rest, you eat well. So there's this whole different experience with it that, they're not looking to like just essentially rag you out and get you to quit. It's more of like a series of things that happen to see if you can operate on alone. And then, if you're in a group of guys, can you be a good team member? Those are kind of the things that they're trying to suss out, right, in SFAS.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So go through the selection process to join the special operations community. So what does that kind of look like?
Well, yeah. So of course, there's SFAS, which I got selected. And then, after you get selected, then you find out essentially what your MOS is going to be, or your, like I talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast, your military occupational specialty, which, of course, in special forces, like you find out what your job's going to be. So I ended up getting assigned the MOS 18 Bravo, which is a weapons sergeant in special forces. So essentially what that means, when you get to a special forces operational detachment alpha, or the team, right, is that's going to be what your job or skill set is. So that's a weapons expert and then a tactics expert. And your responsibility is kind of making sure that the weapon systems are employed properly. There's a large part, I think, in training the rest of the detachment, whether it's on CQB or marksmanship or things like that. And then also advising the commander of your detachment on tactics. That's kind of the textbook reading of kind of what a weapon sergeant does on a special forces detachment.
And then you got assigned where after that?
Yeah. So basically, got the MOS. I went through what's called the SFQC, which is the Special Forces Qualification Course. I guess I have a decent ability to learn a foreign language because I got assigned Arabic, which was interesting.
Okay. How was that process, learning Arabic?
It was tough, to be straight up. It was 6 months of a language course, and my teacher was Egyptian, a good guy from Raleigh, North Carolina. And basically took that language for 6 months, and it was like immersion. So like from the time you walked into the classroom to the time you walked out, the expectation was that you were speaking Arabic. Yeah.
Do you still remember some of the words?
Oh man. Yeah. Truth be told, I actually learned a second language while I was in SF, which was Dari, which is spoken in northern Afghanistan, but it aligns with kind of Persian Farsi, which is spoken in Iran. But through all of my different training, Arabic is the one that probably stuck the most, especially after different deployments in the Middle East and things like that. I think I used that more. So that was the one that stuck more.
Got it.
Yeah. Are you going to ask me something weird like...
like say something in Arabic? No, I'm not going to put you on the spot.
All right, thanks.
Because I don't want you... Yeah, no, you're good. So to jump back in again real quick, just the Q course, right? So anyways, you drive through the Q course, you learn your job, right? They teach you everything you're going to need to know about being a weapons sergeant for the most part, right? As a new guy in SF. You go to your language, and then you do a couple other things as you go through to basically then get you qualified to say, hey, you are at a beginner level for a special forces guy, a new Green Beret, and then you show up to your detachment. So I finished all that and I graduated the Special Forces qualification course in like December of 2005, I think. So 18 Bravo Weapons Sergeant was one of the faster military occupational specialties to graduate from an SF. So like, for example, if I had been picked to be a medic,
those guys go through like 3 years of schooling or something crazy like that.
Got it. Okay.
So this one was relatively quick with me. And quite honestly, it aligned well with the other skill sets that I already had, being in the airborne infantry and all the things that I had already done. So I was excited about, when I got that MOS, I was like, hey, this is a good fit. Went through that and then, graduated in 2005. And then I reported to 3rd Special Forces Group in January of 2006.
And what rank were you at that point?
Actually, when I was going through the Q course, I had made Sergeant First Class. So it was kind of weird. Like I was pending a promotion all the way through the Q course. And then when I showed up to my first Special Forces company in 3rd Special Forces Group, I got promoted to Sergeant First Class.
Got it.
Yeah.
And how was that transition going into being the fucking new guy coming into a Special Forces Group?
Of course I was new, so I kept my mouth shut, which a bit of advice for anybody starting something new, if you're a first responder or DOD or whatever, when you go somewhere new, if there's experienced people there, you should pay attention to them and learn from them. And that's been a truth outside in the civilian world as well, or it's held true. But yeah, I mean, I was excited. I was new. I was like, hey man, like this is where I want to be, and when I first got to my first unit, which was Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Special Forces Group, they were still in Afghanistan. They were actually ending a trip. So they were finishing up and getting ready to come back. Oddly enough, that trip is when Operation Red Wings happened, which is regularly talked about. And I'm trying to think of kind of the specifics along with it, but that's basically where you have the Lone Survivor movie. It was all based off of that, right? So you had, I think it was Murphy was a Medal of Honor recipient SEAL and all those different things. So one of the interesting things as a new guy, when I first showed up to my Special Forces company, was reading the classified AAR of Operation Red Wings, and it was required reading for us at the time because there were a lot of lessons learned that went through that.
Got it. All right. And then, so being the new guy, how long were you there before you were operational and found yourself on another deployment?
Let's see. So basically, I showed up in 2006, and it was, I think, a unique experience because I felt like it was a draft. I showed up with a group of new guys, and all the teams had come back from Afghanistan, right? They were, I was hoping that we were going to get sent over right away to somehow get worked in with the teams, but they were literally like 2
on their
weeks.
Way back.
They were like 2 to 3 weeks out from coming home. So, of course, the group command and everybody else was like, hey, you'll wait at the company and you guys will be ready to help the teams when they come back in, right? So when everybody got back, it was like literally like a fucking draft. Like I'll never forget one of the guys that's, been most impactful in my life, and I still wear him on my wrist because, he was killed in action, but was a guy named Benjamin Bittner, and we would end up being teammates for, I think, about 3 years and do a combat rotation together. And then I would end up going to another unit inside a 3rd Special Forces Group, serving alongside of him. But I remember him coming down and specifically kind of looking at all the new guys and like sizing everybody up. And, he just had a really interesting personality, was super abrasive, which I thought was entertaining. And we were all new, and I ended up getting picked to go down to, at the time, ODA 366, Operational Detachment Alpha 366 was my first team, and they had a mountaineering specialty. So that was the first SF team that I was on. Of course, crazy, awesome experiences there, going to, mountaineering training in Colorado and Alaska and all these different places where I quickly realized that, hey, you're, the level that they, or the amount of money and the level that they spend and put into you is like, it's crazy, right? They the special operations community truly wants to make you an expert at the things that you're supposed to be an expert in, right? So got there, but my first deployment on that detachment was in 2007. We ended up in Afghanistan. So,
and that was the first time in Afghanistan.
Yeah, first time in Afghanistan. So I'd already been to Iraq.
Yep.
And then first time in Afghanistan was 07.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so I assume when you got to Afghanistan, you were getting tasked with special missions and you were jumping on helos to go to a certain area to do missions and all that.
Yeah, that was a pretty unique experience in that I feel like it was pretty true to the SF mission, which is essentially they put you out in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of local nationals, and then basically you're like, hey, go figure it out. Like, go mix it up with the enemy. And I was on that team. It was an exceptional team. A lot of really good guys, a lot of really experienced guys. And, we got out and we started mixing it up, man. Like right off the bat, it was, hey, develop intelligence, get fed intelligence from the battalion, and then go out and chase bad guys and kill bad guys. And we did that.
Got it.
Yeah.
And essentially, you talk about how much money was put into you guys to be experts. And
sure.
Did you essentially have the availability to whatever you wanted and whatever the team wanted, gear-wise, training-wise?
I think, well, not anything we wanted, but I mean, we certainly had an array of different things that we could request or bring to the table. Yeah, I mean, good budget, good training, good equipment, good gear, all that stuff was definitely in the mix, and then, I mean, the crazy thing about that deployment, I specifically remember at the time our battalion commander talking to us. My detachment ended up going out, to a pretty isolated area that basically was like 150 kilometers of Afghanistan, Pakistan border that we had with like a battalion of the Afghan National Army, and then a small regular army, what they called ETTs, which then were the embedded tactical trainers for like the regular Afghan National Army. Of course, we had a little crew of Afghans that we worked with and trained that were like our little special operations guys that worked with us, about 20 of those guys. And they would go out and do all the missions, that we wanted to do. And yeah, I mean, we were out in the middle of nowhere, and literally our guidance was like, disrupt the enemy network. Like that was it. You know what I mean? And then, we had helo support. We had all the different kinds of support that we needed. But our responsibility was like to help develop everything and then go and mix it up.
Got it.
Yeah.
And that stems directly from when you went through the, why am I drawing a blank on it now? Where it was the whiteboard where it gave you the timeline where it was like, just be back here by this time.
Yeah, exactly.
Go, right?
Like
so it's teaching you to be able to do that.
Yeah. Hundreds of miles away from, another level of responsibility, if you will.
Yeah.
And all that responsibility was given to us. And the expectation is that you go out and execute.
Got it. And you were in country for how long on that deployment?
That rotation was just shy, I think, of 8 months.
Okay.
So the typical SF rotation around that time was about 6, 7, 8 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was constant firefights, and can you kind of touch on those 8 months? Like,
yeah, so
what the timeline was like?
It was a little bit different, I guess, in a sense of every time we went out, like the goal was definitely to go kill the enemy. So we knew we had a good idea of where the enemy was operating in the area. We did have to develop that over some time, but I think we did that relatively quickly. And then once we figured that out, we were like, hey, we get into gunfights every time we go into this area and we kill dudes in here. So we're going to continue to go in here and do that until either we kill all the bad guys, or force them out of this area. And so it was essentially just sustained operations like that. And the way we were working back then was, we'd pack up and leave on our trucks for 2 weeks, and live off the fire base, if you will, right, where all your little creature comforts are at. And we'd live off of our trucks. And what we quickly found back then was, excuse me, is that the Taliban in our area were not as well supplied maybe as in some other areas. So if we stayed out longer and pressed them harder, they would run out of fuel, they'd run out of ammo, they'd run,
out of all resources that they needed to.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, we ended up, killing bad guys. We'd press them so hard that they would ditch their motorcycles with RPGs and machine guns, leave everything laying there because they didn't want to get killed.
Yeah.
And, I think we did a pretty good job of what our overall mission statement was, which was disrupt the enemy network in the area. We did that,
Got it.
So.
And how many guys were on your team doing these like missions where you guys were, excuse me, on your own for a few weeks at a time or whatever? How many of there were you?
Depending on how we were set up and what our responsibilities were, usually we'd have a couple guys stay behind at the fire base because, we had a lot of logistics there and everything else. And they kind of were responsible for what was going on there, which wasn't, the fire base got attacked at times with, both indirect systems or a direct attack or whatever. And you had to be prepared for that, right? So you didn't get overrun.
Yeah.
And then, and then some of us would end up going out on what we called, a long range patrol or whatever. And then go mix it up for a couple weeks, and then we'd come back and guys would rotate on different duties. So again, I was on a really good team. Everybody was willing to go out and get it on, which was cool. So that was a really positive experience for my first deployment.
Got it.
With special operations.
Yeah, and how many did you do total with special operations?
Let's see. So I think all in total, when everything was done, I think I ended up with roughly, close to 40 months in combat.
Total.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I break it down that way based off of different trips. So obviously I had the first one, that was almost a year.
Yep.
And then, consecutively after that, going to different places, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then other places. That add up was just shy of, 40 months downrange. So definitely a lot of time on the ground. Lots of good experiences and definitely a lot of memories.
Yeah, and some of those memories are traumatic and difficult memories.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff. Yeah. And then there's some bad stuff that goes along with that. That's just the reality.
Yeah. And obviously that's as you stated before, that's like what you signed up before. You were talked about that before, where it's like, hey, the longer that you stay in this community, you're going to continue to see fucked up shit, essentially.
Yeah, that talk from First Sergeant Murphy,
Yeah.
rang true and held true, throughout my career. I mean, essentially, it's a simple math equation, right? The longer the amount of time and the longer you're doing something high risk, the higher the chances are that you're going to see some fucked up shit and you're going to experience some intense shit.
Yeah. And so those missions, how did they differ from when you were before your time in Special Forces?
I think for the most part for me, I think the intensity level was different. Like it was like, you rotated in and then you were very quickly, getting after it. You know what I mean? And then, my first deployment was unique in the sense that it was part of an invasion of, another country.
Yeah.
And so everything that went along with that, a lot of good learning experiences with that. But, when I got to special operations, the trips after that, the intensity level was definitely a lot higher, right? Because you're getting more missions, the intelligence is better, there's a specificity about what you're doing. And so the intensity is just a higher intensity level.
Got it. And with that higher intensity level, and this is coming from the point of what we're doing at the Overwatch Collective, was there an increase in support and resources?
Yeah, I think
for you guys.
I think initially, no. I think initially a lot of this stuff was lacking. I think towards the end of my career that, especially in the special operations community, they started to figure out real quick that guys are having issues and they need to address them quickly. I can remember in the beginning though of that kind of cycle, a lot of guys were afraid to say they had issues because they were afraid of being taken off of a team. And when you get to special forces or when you're in special operations, the team is everything. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot that happens when you leave where you have to reprogram your brain. It's like taking care of yourself. And I still struggle with this a bit, feels selfish, and that's just it's funny. Like you talk to anybody that's been a civilian and they're like, hey man, like I know what it's like to take care of myself. But for some weird reason, like, we've built into that community that taking care of yourself is a selfish thing to do, and that's a very, in my opinion, dangerous thing. And guys, if I could give any kind of a piece of advice for anybody, if they're transitioning out of the military or law enforcement or anything else, and you've been part of a highly functioning team, that if it feels weird to take care of yourself, it's actually not. And you need to do that. So like I'm saying, initially, when I was in third group, there weren't a bunch of things that I was aware of that were available for you to get help. But as I got deeper into my career in third group and different events started happening with guys individually, then it started really becoming like, hey, we need to get mental health experts in here. Like guys have far more amount of time than I had in combat rotations. And we're seeing kind of the, what's happening with that. And we need to get people in here to help these guys out. So I will say, initially, I don't think it was the best, but it certainly got better over time.
Got it.
Yeah.
And was there, so like in the teams, was there any of that, like comparing your trauma or your experience to your seniors?
I think,
because I think that's one of the big things with part of the problem of like speaking up and asking for help or saying like raising your head and you're raising the red flag and being like, hey, you know what? Like I'm kind of messed up from this. I've been like having some PTSD episodes, not sleeping. I've been drinking a lot, or I got shit going on at home where like an example would be you going, you being the new guy and already your past, you've been blown up in an IED, hit your head, so you have TBI.
Sure.
And then the mass casualty incident where you got to experience that. And then amongst that, you have others.
Sure.
And then you're here, but then you come into special operations, which is completely new to you. But you have guys that have been in for X amount of years where, I mean, you just said it, where it's like you have guys with all this experience. So do you kind of see that problem in special operations, like in your time, where there was a lot of like comparing trauma where the new guys wouldn't really say much? Or
I think definitely culturally, like if you were new, like you wouldn't disclose, that stuff again, in fear of, all this work and effort that you had essentially gone through, it'd be you leave a team. And at that time for me, like the goal was always to be on a team. And quite honestly, I wasn't having any issues with anything that I had been through previously. So for me, again, it was the next level. And I was hungry, to participate, and so, I mean, I think for me, my own experiences with kind of processing trauma and processing events that happened to me during my military career, that didn't affect me until I ended up going through the medical retirement process.
Got it.
And I mean, just shy of 20 years, on active duty, but ended up med retiring. And then kind of once I knew everything was over and I wasn't on a team anymore, that's when kind of there was an accounting, or like it was weird, man. It was like I replayed like all these memories in my mind, and it was like everything that I had compartmentalized was unlocked.
Yeah. Okay. And it was coming to life again because you had time to think about it.
And there were like, there were different moments where I can remember this where, I'd be watching a TV show that had like an emotional scene. And, it was like, I would get emotional and I'm like, what? Like normally that wouldn't, you know what I mean? And at the time when I was going through my med retirement, I had taken advantage of jumping in and speaking with a mental health professional that was at 3rd Special Forces Group and talking to that person. I was like, hey, like, why am I experiencing like all these weird, like, that's not me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I normally wouldn't get emotional like during these things. And of course they did a really good job breaking it down for me. And it's like, hey, like, you've opened up and kind of described all these different things to me. And, you have a lot of stuff that you've kept compartmentalized or locked up in your brain. And now all this stuff is kind of releasing itself. So there may be some things that you didn't get appropriate time to grieve over or, kind of process. And so you may see, different times where you might get emotional about something that you normally wouldn't have. And that to me, I mean, first and foremost, like going in and getting that explanation, one, I didn't feel ashamed about it.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And so for me, it was like, hey, this is just my way of processing all this stuff. And, I don't need to be ashamed about how some of these things are happening.
Yeah. And I think that's great to hear that you weren't ashamed to do that, because I feel like a lot of people are, because of
Yeah, man. I mean,
the stigma and the culture behind it. And it's difficult. Like you talk about like for myself as a police officer about like reaching out to someone for help and being really careful what you say, because you don't want it to affect your promotion from officer to sergeant
dude,
because of you reaching
yeah.
out. It doesn't, you got to be careful of what you say, because you don't want to get placed on a psychiatric hold where they have to take your firearms, and then
exactly.
your whole identity is fucked, where it's kind of the same thing. But I think even more for our like special operators in the military, where you've literally gone through so much and worked your ass off, and there's years of training and getting literally destroyed and fucking rock bottom, where you're like, okay, all I want to do is be a part of this. Where I think a lot of the times, and correct me if I'm wrong, where there are probably a lot of service members that are in those positions that put that shit to the side and they're like, fuck it, I'm going to do whatever I can to forget it, because I'm in this elite status that I've worked my ass off to get to, and I'll deal with that shit later.
Yeah. I if anybody were to listen to this that's on active duty now, one of the biggest pieces of advice, and this would go for a first responder as well, is like, however cool you think that job is and what you're a part of, like nothing is worth kind of your own health and being proactive and potentially identifying something sooner than later. That could save all the things that you're concerned about, and in the same token, those that are in leadership positions in those organizations have a responsibility to be able to hear their people, and when they need help, get them help. And maintaining that person's mental health, only helps accomplish the mission in the end, because you're extending that person's longevity in the organization anyways. Now, you're going to have some one-offs. Maybe people aren't necessarily built for the job, but giving people a healthy release somewhere, and getting ahead of the issues before they compound and become catastrophic. I think it's important in kind of talking through that process and making sure that your agency, or Department of Defense or whoever has things set up. So again, like you're talking about, there isn't a fear of reprisal, right? Where you lose your career, you lose all these things by kind of reaching out and saying, hey, I need to talk about this and I need to be able to process this in a healthy way, and being proactive about that will definitely save more lives, one, and people won't get to a point where they feel like they can't get help, you know what I mean? And just kind of, having the ability to, but again, I mean, not only is the responsibility on you as a person in that organization, right, to get help, but then the whole system has to be set up where, you're not being negatively affected by that. And then, hey, let's be honest, like, when you're in positions of authority and you have to make, certain types of decisions, like it's up to, maybe that team and yourself about what you can and can't handle. And if you can't kind of work your way through something, or be, good with something, or however you want to describe that, maybe that's not the profession for you.
Yeah. And I think something that you mentioned is that we kind of need to be proactive with the resources, having the conversations, to being able to recognize and identify a problem that you're going through, or a traumatic time that you may need resources with, or something that needs your immediate attention. And a majority of it that I see is all reactionary.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Like the whole
dude gets himself in trouble.
Yeah. It's
literally
all
shit's
reactionary.
all falling apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you don't get that help, or you don't recognize that you need additional resources, or you need to raise that red flag.
Yeah.
Until you're already at the bottom of the roller coaster.
Sure.
Which is obviously something that we're trying to do, is like, hey, let's recognize these before.
Totally. I was just going to say, one of the big things about the Overwatch Collective is, one, you guys, you're doing that. You're providing those services for people. And then, quite honestly, like, who knows, man? Like, some agencies still not maybe, matured in their support network. And if a law enforcement person or whoever reaches out to get help, maybe they will be ostracized. So having other options, like that's another great reason to have the Overwatch Collective, because you're able to come in as an additional support network, if you will, and provide that for someone.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that. And there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into it, but it's nice to like sit down and talk to you, hearing about it from like the special operations side, because we can talk to all the police officers and firefighters and dispatch, and kind of have like the first responder side covered.
Sure.
Where like for us, it's like the SWAT officers are kind of like our tier 1 level, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's nice to finally tackle this.
Well, and I mean, another important part of this is, you've got a lot of people that did some, they did a lot of really exceptional things for the country. And, being a part of the community of guys that I came out of, a lot of those guys still need help, even when they're long gone from the military. And they may finally, be able to kind of come to a point where they're like, hey, I need help or whatever. So again, having, essentially you guys, having the mission that you have, which is not only helping first responders, but veterans as well. Of course, when I met you and you described everything you guys were doing, immediately I gravitated towards that, because, which one of us that hasn't, that's done the job doesn't want to help our brothers and sisters, right? Like, you want to make sure that they get the best opportunity and chances that they have to have successful careers, have healthy families and everything else. So, for me, that's an easy motivator, to essentially watch what you're doing and be like, hell yeah, man, like, how can I help?
Yeah. And I appreciate it. And like from day one of us talking about it, you were like, how can I help? And it's amazing, because you talk about the first deployment when you were hit by the IED, when the rest of the team was fighting the IED, fighting the insurgents to come back to save you guys. And at any point, one of them could have taken a round and fucking died. But it's all about the team. And then you go into the special operations community and you talk about the team, and you want to be a part of the team. And, and how big it is. And I think we do such a good job of taking care of each other when you're active.
Oh yeah.
Because you're always around each other, right? Yeah. You're wearing fucking short shorts to the pool at 06:30. You're essentially doing everything together, because you're away from your loved ones, your friends, and you're all together in this team environment where you essentially, I feel like there are a lot of people in the military community where they're closer to their teammates than their actual family.
Yeah, you spend a lot of time together.
And then the difficult side of that is when you leave that, obviously, because you have all of these experiences.
Yep.
I know you talked a lot about the firefights and the engagements that you've been in.
Sure.
Two kind of things that I want to jump into before we start talking about the demobilization processes for each deployment, and then the retirement processes. The feeling and the effects of taking another life. So don't need to get into like super specifics.
Okay.
But I am curious, and like I mentioned before, this is a lot of first for the podcast, is we've never had someone on that has been a police officer or in the military that has taken another life,
Sure.
that has talked about the effects of that. And obviously you have taken a lot of lives for our country.
Yeah, I don't know.
Correct me, but I'm trying to get in here. This is, like I said, this is the first time, but I kind of want to talk about, like, really briefly the effects of like taking someone's life for the mission for the country.
Yeah. So I'm sure that this weighs differently on different people. I think for me, I have no issues with the things that I've done in my career. When I was in special operations in the regular Army, everything that, I was involved in, I consider, a righteous mission. And, yeah, I mean, being a part of that, yeah, I mean, essentially, when you're in a gunfight, it's either kill or be killed, and for me, it kind of breaks you down to a pretty basic level as a human being. The effect that it had on me, I'm sure there's some type of effect psychologically, but, I maybe morally and everything else am good with everything that I've ever done downrange. And again, I feel like the mission was righteous, like what we were doing, hunting other armed men. That was all part of it, and when you do that, and when your life's on the line and your teammates' lives are on the line, that all comes with it, but it wasn't something that ever deterred me from doing it. Probably the best way I can describe it is I didn't take pleasure in it, but I didn't I didn't dislike it. It was part of the job. And kind of my way, and maybe this is just how I'm psychologically built, but a lot of things I take on, or I have a very kind of professional approach in the way that I kind of tackle those things in my own opinion. And I kind of view combat and, taking someone's life in the confines of that. And maybe that's how I make it okay with myself. But it certainly isn't something that keeps me up at night.
Okay. Is that kind of a common theme amongst the special operations community, do you think, with the mission sets that you guys have? Or have you experienced teammates having a tough time with maybe their first time experiencing that, or their first firefight, or anything along the lines of that?
Yeah, good question. I appreciate you asking. For me, my experiences with teammates, I think the most traumatic things have been losing Americans, whether it was losing a teammate or, guys that in the community. I certainly feel like that's been more impactful than guys being on teams and going out and, prosecuting targets, if you will. I think you got to be a pretty righteous person to want to be in special operations. And if you didn't believe in what you were doing, you probably wouldn't be there in the first place. And when you're going after dudes that kill women and children and do a lot of things that morally I definitely have a problem with, like, again, for me, it doesn't keep me up at night at all.
Yeah.
And I'm good with all of it.
Yeah.
So.
And that kind of goes in with I know we talked about this earlier, but is with the moral injury.
Yeah.
Where it's like
you had to I made you read. I think we talked about moral injury, and I was like, can you read me the definition of that? Because I need to understand that a little bit better.
I needed to look it up myself too. And I'll pull it up here a little bit. Yeah. But and I appreciate you sharing that. And I know it's not like it's not a topic that really gets discussed much, because So I had neighbors growing up when I was first getting into the Marine Corps. I don't know if it was before or right when I got back from like boot camp, where they were Army 11 Bravos infantry, where
Yeah.
they got back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and I know they were in the shit.
Yeah.
But it's always like a weird question, a weird topic to bring up. Like how do you ask another human being, like, because you don't know what their reaction is going to be like, right? You don't know if it's like traumatic, if it's still affecting them, or if they're totally okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of don't know what reaction you're going to get, and you're kind of tiptoeing around it like you're walking on eggshells. So I appreciate you being okay with me asking it and talking about it.
Yeah.
But that's also, it kind of correlates to how we feel asking if another service member or first responder is going to kill themselves.
Sure.
Or is going through a fucked up time where they don't know where to go.
Yeah.
Like if you recognize that someone's not on their A game or they're not the same,
sure,
you start to see people walk on eggshells and be like, do I ask Greg or Kurt if he's going through a tough time and like, does he need anything? And sometimes you may ask, but you don't know what reaction you're going to get, or you don't ask at all.
Yeah. I would say that being a good teammate, like being authentic and caring about people, is really important. And that if you do see that, you should ask, because, you know, having any kind of a reservation with it, even if you feel like it's going to be an awkward conversation, like that may be what that person needed to kind of drive whatever's going on in a different direction. So again, empathy, you know, not being afraid to have that conversation. If you love what you do and you love the people around you, you'll be willing to have those conversations, and you have to. Those are honest conversations, right? And nobody escapes the effects of violence. You know, all the things that you guys see as a first responder, what you see in combat, nobody escapes the effects of that. Now, how much it affects you on a scale, whatever measuring thing they use or whatever else. I mean, every individual person is different. People were raised differently. Their psychological makeup is different. Some people can take more than others, you know? And I mean, yeah, there's this whole thing, right, that goes into leadership and knowing the people that you work with and being close and caring about one another. And as the closer you are to somebody, you're going to kind of know, you know, what their capability is for withstanding a lot of that stuff, right? And I think, of course, there's an expectation that comes along with those jobs that you can just take it, right? But we all know that if you've done it for a long time or you've done it at all and seen some terrible shit, you probably need to talk about it, man. It doesn't mean, you know, you got to talk about it all the fucking time.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But you might need to have a good sounding board to talk through something, and that's okay, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the tough things for the kind of the community in a whole. And when you talk about being a sergeant or like a team leader or a squad leader in the military, whatever, where you kind of, it takes a really strong person to like open up and be like, hey, you know, I've been through this. I've gone to therapy. I've been divorced. I went through therapy. And then that helps the juniors kind of be like, wow, okay, the person that I look up to.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're being a leader. If your authenticity and your openness, you know, will directly impact the people that you lead.
Yeah. And I think it's super difficult. And like, I've been talking about it more and more, but especially being a police officer, it's like every time you put on the vest, it's like you're fucking Superman and nothing's going to affect you. And then you take the vest off and it's like everything's supposed to be left at work, which is not the case. And same thing for you go to throw on your body armor and you go on a mission, the shit that you see, the stuff that you experience, it sticks with you forever. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is true, where like I can ask you these questions about your first deployment, your second deployment, and you can relive it and explain it in great detail, where your body, your brain, even though you're really fucking good at compartmentalizing, still remembers all of those. And some of those may be really bad experiences that, and I'm not saying this about you, but for other service members
Sure.
that may be really affecting them,
Absolutely.
where they don't know how to process it,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're not getting the potential resources that they need.
Right.
And then that's where we see the unfortunate spiral downhill, which is
Yeah.
ultimately leading
There's
to
all kinds of
potential death
effects
by
to that, right?
suicide.
Yeah. I think again, one of the biggest things that I've learned through my service and being around, similar folks, and whether it's first responders, the military, or anything, is that everybody's level and what they can take is different. And, again, if there was one thing that I could reiterate, or encourage people that are listening to this podcast, is that if you do need help, you shouldn't be afraid to get help. And hopefully, I feel like with, 20 plus years of war in the GWAT, and all the things that are going on in the streets today with law enforcement and everything else, I hope, my hope would be is that leadership, command teams, things like that, realize like, hey, it's important to make sure that your folks are taken care of. And that if you do have an issue and you speak out about it, that person shouldn't be ostracized or, sidelined, unless it's something, so serious that you can't perform your duties. That's a different conversation. And
then it may be a cry for help, potentially.
Yeah. Or just, I mean, like, let's be honest, like, you guys are charged with a lot of responsibility when you go out and protect the public. You know what I mean? Like, if you can't make good decisions, or, or you're a detriment to yourself or the team, like, there's also a certain amount of personal responsibility there and professional responsibility that maybe you need to take a break and get your head right, before you jump back in.
Yeah. And I think speaking from the first responder part of things, it's, I think we're starting to see more of these peer support teams and
yeah, absolutely.
And all this, which is really good. It's definitely like a check in the box.
Sure.
So I experienced one of my friends died by suicide.
Mm-hmm.
This was probably about 5-6 years ago. And it didn't really get the ball rolling with the peer support team or really discussing mental health or anything until maybe last year sometime. So, and that goes back to the whole reactionary thing.
Sure.
Right? Where it's not like our first responder in our military community is like, hey, this is what we could be doing proactively in case of a mass casualty or an active shooter that goes south or a hostage rescue, so that our guys and gals have all the resources available. It's kind of reactionary. You learn from everything, and then like, how do we prevent that next time?
Yeah.
But I've like for the military side of things, like I'm just like, I'm in the Coast Guard Reserves and I go take a leak and I see the VA fucking resources above the urinal next to all the specs and max effective range for a 50 cal.
Yeah.
And what are you going to look at? Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the only resources that I'm seeing now in the military where either you're on the shitter looking at the VA resources and your equal opportunity officer above the urinal. And then on the board where like they have it in every unit where it's all the resources and the pay that you should get and all that. But as far as the military side things of being like an active reservist, like I'm not really seeing even like a reactionary course of action to get resources for
additional help, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, I mean, again, we've got different perspectives, right? Not necessarily you and I, but like based off of experience and what VA, let's say, for example, you've been to, what resources are available to you, what area do you live in? All these things are different, right? So, I think for me, obviously one, it highlights what you guys are doing, the importance of still being able to support organizations that step in and fill the gap. I think probably the VA does a good job in some places, and in some places it doesn't. You know what I mean? And depending on where you live, those resources may be better set up than other places, right? So, what I don't subscribe to is, group think or overarching opinions that are like, oh, this place sucks. Like, I'm gonna go find out myself. You know what I mean? Like, if the VA sucks in Palo Alto, like, I'll know because I go there. You know what I mean? Now,
Yeah.
You know
And
what
I'll
I'm
try
saying?
San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get a lot of opinions in the veteran community that the VA sucks, right?
And
Well,
that's the common theme. That's what we hear a lot is
right.
the VA is terrible. The VA is terrible.
Right.
But,
And I'm certainly not discounting anybody's opinion or their
yeah.
experience when they go in and, if they're treated poorly or whatever. But I can tell you from the beginning of my career and hearing about, everything and the resources that are available to now, there's certainly more now than there were. Does that mean they're great? Maybe not. It depends on what area you're in, because I also know, I've had some positive experiences. Let's say, for example, with my my general physician at the VA in Palo Alto. She's been great. You know what I mean? And she's been helpful in all the ways that she can be. And then, let's say, for example, I needed, mental health therapy or whatever you want to call it. I've developed a relationship with you and I know what you guys do, and I wouldn't be afraid of reaching out for that. You own some responsibility as an individual to develop your network so that, it's no different than me going and, being on an ODA and going and fighting and all the preparation work that we did and everything else. Now that I'm out, like, I have a responsibility for myself to have those things available to me. You know what I mean? And to reach out. And the way social media works and everything these days, like, I feel like there's a lot of things there that if you do need help, you can reach out and ask for help, and there's a good chance that you're going to get it. You know what I mean? So if you're listening to this and you feel like you're isolated and everything else, hey, reach out to Greg at Overwatch and say so.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of negative stuff with social media.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people get in trouble with social media and what you post, and there's a lot of arguments, internal affairs investigations.
But there's a lot of good things too, right?
As well.
Yeah.
Yes. And I like what you said, where the responsibility falls on yourself.
Well, I mean,
the service member.
There's a portion of the responsibility that I feel like.
Yes, because you should, I think in a perfect world, when you join the military, you should be handed a pamphlet of every resource available.
Sure.
Your spouse,
it'd be nice if you said, hey, I'm going to transition out. This is the area I'll be in. And they said, hey, here's all the resources that are available 100%. If you're having a hard time.
And not only for you, but for the spouse, the significant other, right. The family members.
And this is I just want to throw in a quick one on this. Like, DOD might be doing that. I have no idea. I mean, again, you're still participating in certain ways.
Yeah,
but I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I have not seen it.
If some installations are doing that, hey, good on you. Because that makes sense to me. Like, hey, if you have service members transitioning to certain areas, like, it would make sense that, you would give them contact information. Correct. And different things where they can help people.
Yeah. So if you're going to do, like active duty of PCS, permanent change of duty station, where
sure.
I don't think it's a thing where it's like, oh yeah, you're PCS to North Carolina. You're going to be in Camp Lejeune.
Sure.
Here are all the resources around here. Yeah. Here's what people say. Here's reviews, blah, blah, blah. Oh, you're married. Here's stuff for your spouse, your significant other, your kids. Okay, here's all the resources. I don't think that's really happening, but I think there's so much going on with like the VA, with the military. And I know the VA's like short-staffed.
Yeah.
And we have therapists that we work with and people that we work with that also work with the VA.
Sure.
Who have told us that they're trying to do whatever they can.
Yeah.
And they're amazing humans that want to help the vets.
Yeah.
But sometimes they're limited on the resources.
Yeah.
It's like being a cop some of the times where you're limited on resources. But
the unfortunate part about the government in general, and I know this because I worked for the government for so long, is, they don't necessarily do everything the best. There's a lot of taxpayer dollars and everything else that get injected all over the place. But sometimes, the intent, how it starts, doesn't end up, in the end, that's not how it's executed. And so, again, I think that's why it's important for nonprofits and other folks that care, to have the ability to step in where there's a gap and be able to fill that gap. And you've done a really good job at doing that, which is, again, when I met you and we talked about everything, I was like, hey, man, like, this makes sense, because there's going to be, unfortunately, whether it's an agency or, somewhere where they missed the mark in Department of Defense or whatever, where they're not going to catch something, and so you being able to fill those gaps or maybe become the primary in certain circumstances is a good thing.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. And it's not just us. It's where the whole collective part comes in, where been talking a lot about teamwork, where it's a team where we work with other nonprofits, other services, other people, anything where it's like, if you were to reach out, we can get you pointed in the right direction. And it's not like, oh no, like we do everything or you have to come to us. Like,
sure,
if we can help, and that's where the motto of one more is one less comes into play, which we'll get into in a little bit, but it's like, if we can help one fucking person, like
you did your job,
get some sort of help, then like mission success,
Absolutely.
And I do think, so something that you brought up earlier that I want to touch on is like doing your own research. But I think in our community, you need to be resourceful.
Yeah.
And you need to use social media platforms, use Google, like use whatever you can to find other resources to be able to help you.
So there's a really interesting thing that I read. Doesn't happen all the time, but on Instagram. And there's a page on there called Havoc Journal.
Yep, I follow him.
Yeah. And it was a young Ranger NCO basically that had transitioned out of the military, but he gave a really good opinion about what the exclusivity in serving in special operations was like. And then when you leave that, he was having a hard time with that transition process and kind of building, just a network of people on the outside because he wasn't surrounded by all these guys who had, shared similar experiences, right? And the one key thing that I took away from that was, not to limit yourself to have relationships with other people, regardless of what you did in your background, but to make the effort to connect with other people and have a good social network, whether it's during the transition process, whether you've been out for, like me, 5-6 years, it's important to have a support network, but the thing that really stuck with me was like, he was like, hey, I could have self-isolated and, thought everybody else was a dirtbag because they didn't do X, Y, and Z like I did. He's like, but I had to approach things with a different mindset and learn about other people and the different things that they did and essentially not hold it against them because they weren't in special operations, and all these different experiences that he had. He was like, hey, if I had just stayed to myself, like I wouldn't talk to anybody, because now I'm a civilian. Now I'm away from all the stuff that I did and I don't have that network of people around me anymore. So I need to build a new one. And that for me was pretty impactful, man, because I can certainly get in my own head, and feel like I don't have things in common with other people or that, my intensity levels about certain topics aren't the same. Or, I look at the world through a different lens because of the things that I've experienced. But I have to remind myself, that one, not to hold that against people because they haven't experienced the same things I have.
Yeah.
And be comfortable, with trying to develop a different network of people, So.
Yeah, I think you just explained the whole fucking transition process without even talking about it. No, and it's perfect. I mean, you literally said everything that like I wanted to talk about. And I think anybody that listens to that last fucking minute and 18 seconds can understand it. And it is super important to talk about because when you're active or reserve, you have all these resources available to you. And then on the first responder side, like you're still going to fire call. Like if you're a firefighter, you're still going to all these calls. You're ripping code through. You're having fun. You're talking shit on the fire engine while you're going to these calls and doing dumb fun shit. The biggest thing is you have those guys and gals around you. Yes, and you're doing what you love, and it's keeping you busy. It's kind of distracting you from the shit that you're gonna have to deal with when you're done.
Right.
But there are so many times where like people will reach out to us for therapy and they have to fill out their 1 to 2 page form saying like, hey, this is who I am. I'm a first responder. I'm a service member, spouse, significant other. I'm requesting to work with X person or I want to work with someone. This is kind of what I've been going through. And there's so many retirees out there that don't have the right direction. They don't have any direction at all. Maybe they don't have any resources at all for what is it like to be a retired dispatcher. After experiencing
that's a lot of shit, right?
20 years of taking terrible 911 calls or guiding someone through CPR and listen to all these fucking things. Or for you, someone saying like, hey, give this ring to my wife if I don't fucking make it. Like, this is the reality in our community. And like, when that stops, when you get your retirement date of January 1, 2024, like, you are no longer a dispatcher. You are no longer in special operations. You're out. You're at home. You're in San Francisco, and maybe you got a place by yourself, or you're with a roommate that works Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. And it's a super easy path to go down, I think, in my opinion, to kind of be like, okay, I'm away. Like, and there's so many things to kind of think about and then get depressed because of that, where it's like, okay, I'm not like, I know my guys, because I'm still talking to them or still follow them. Like, they're going over here and doing this. Like, fuck, I want to be with them so bad. And then and then for the military community, like, think about the guys that get out, their team goes on the next deployment. And then he or she is at home, hears shit that goes on there and is affecting, like, if I was still in, I could have done this. Or, and there's just so many factors that go along with it that I think there's such a lack of conversation about the retiree community. And they struggle a lot. There's a lack of resources, and there's a lot of retirees that die by suicide. There was just one San Francisco police officer a month or two ago died by suicide. And it's a problem.
So my own experience, right, with transition, going through a med retirement, the craziest thing for me is that being a Green Beret, like, that's who I was. You know what I mean? My whole identity in life was like attached to that. Like, I, you know, the way that I would describe myself back then, you know, I probably would have said, like, I'm an SF guy first, and then a husband and like all these things, right? And I mean, when you leave that, you're faced with the realization of asking who you are, because you don't do that anymore. That was a job. Now, granted, you know, those experiences and everything else, they stay with you. And I'm super proud of that. You know, I love the guys that I served with. I would do anything for them. There's that, all of that is still incredibly important to me. You know, even the guys doing the job now, like, I think about that a lot and support those guys and know the hardships that come along with that. But in my own head, asking myself, who the fuck am I, man? Like, who am I without this? You know, I think I'm still figuring that out, man. Like, and I just said I've been out for 5 or 6 years, you know what I mean? And I think it takes time to figure that out, because when you do a job with the intensity level like that, it takes over every facet of your life. And I loved it. You know what I mean? So when you don't have it anymore, you know, you are trying to figure that out, you know. And I worked several different jobs when I first got out, you know, trying to find my place out in the civilian world and kind of what that looked like. And of course, now I've ended up in a place where I'm on a team again. You know, the intensity level is different. That's a good thing.
With some of the similar guys with experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And that, you know, that for me, I think has been helpful. And I think, you know, my own personal experience with that is just processing everything, being patient with myself, and knowing that it's okay that I don't do that job anymore, and that that's not who I am anymore full time, if that makes sense. It certainly, you know, those experiences shape me into who I am now. And I look at that and try to draw the positive experiences from that and move forward in life. Probably, you know, the thing I think about the most is wanting to, make sure that my kids know how much I love them and how much I care about what they're doing. And I'm not always the best at communicating that, but, I certainly came to the end of the line and realized like, man, I missed a lot of time. And, if there was obviously you can't catch up for missed time, but you can certainly reorient yourself towards the things that are, that matter the most. And I think one of the biggest things for me is when I left was realizing, my buddy team that my family, like they're the ones that are still here. You know what I mean? Like all these guys that I love them and they're all good guys, but they were continuing the mission and they were continuing doing what they were doing and they had their own families and their own lives and all the things that they were doing. And, realizing that these people that have been beside me the whole entire time, like they're the ones that are going to be there when it's all over, So putting time and energy into that, if you're a young person joining the military now, or you're a law enforcement dude or gal or a first responder, I would highly encourage you to make sure you're paying attention to your family. Because again, they're going to be the ones that are there in the end, hopefully. Yeah, that's probably one of the more impactful things that I realized right off the bat. And then, trying to process everything I had compartmentalized, working through that. And then, I've been through a divorce. I have kids, I've kind of experienced a lot of different things. And through some of those things, I've reached out and gotten help, and just not being afraid to talk through things and make sure that, whatever's going on in your headspace is kind of lined out right so you can continue to live a productive life. And so I certainly haven't done it perfect.
I don't know anybody who has. Why the fuck do you think we're here?
Yeah, I think one of the things though that my own personal standards, I've had some very high levels of expectation for myself. And again, probably one of the bigger things for me now being out and kind of processing everything and doing what I do now is just being patient with myself. And, it might sound weird, but like loving who you are, and, kind of accepting all your flaws and everything else and being patient with yourself, taking care of yourself, putting yourself first. Again, like naturally, that stuff doesn't come natural to me. I have to fight the urge of feeling selfish and then saying, hey, no, you need to take care of yourself. And in the end, again, if you're not taking care of yourself and you have a family and other people around you that are counting on you, your team, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of them. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hardest things for us to do in the community is to be selfish.
Yeah.
Because literally, you would run from position A to position B when under enemy fire,
sure,
to save another teammate.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then like the first responder community, like you would do whatever you can for a civilian or a fellow first responder to be able to save their life. And
yeah,
you took an oath to that and everything. And for you to be selfish,
yeah,
that's like what the fuck? That's not one of my 14 leadership characteristics.
Well, I don't even like, I mean, self-care, like I don't like describing it as being selfish. It's just self-care.
Yeah.
And, if you're going to be an integral part of a team or anything else, like if you're not healthy first and foremost, how the fuck are you going to participate and make the team successful, right? So I think it's kind of a reprogramming of how we kind of think about things in general is kind of what's been most impactful for me. And again, it's like looking at it going, hey, if you're not good with yourself and everything that's going on, you're not going to be good for the team. And, it's just kind of a, again, having a retalk and programming of what that looks like. So.
Yeah. And I think something that would help that is, which they're kind of starting to do amongst like the first responder community. I don't know if they're doing it in the military community. I haven't seen it. Is annual check-ins with a therapist. So my brother's a firefighter down in Southern California.
Okay.
Lives near your daughter.
Yeah.
And they do annual check-ins with a therapist at their fire department.
Okay.
Which I think is really cool.
Yeah. I mean, at a minimum, you would think that's going on, right?
We'll fucking start somewhere. We'll take 30 minutes out of 365 days.
Yeah.
Because that's a proactive step to get you into a room with someone, a professional that understands what you go through, to offer some advice, to be able to get something off your chest, something off your shoulders. And if it's not a good experience for you, like, then maybe it's not for you.
Sure.
If it helps one person and they go seek therapy and that saves their marriage, their relationship with their kids, or they can overcome a trauma that they saw and experienced due to the job, then that's a win.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So I think as much as it seems like, hey, one time a year for 30 minutes, you're going to, on shift, you're going to go and talk to someone, seems like that's it. Like that's all you're going to do. But I think that's like the stepping stone.
Sure. It's a check-in and then a segue to, you know, if you need help, like at least there's something available, right?
Yeah. And I think it increases the talk of the community to discuss the like normality of therapy, because I feel like a lot of us hear the word therapy or therapist and they like about face and fucking run away because you don't know what it looks like. You don't know what you can and cannot say.
Yeah.
But I think doing annual check-ins is a start in the right direction. But I think I'd like to see that amongst the entire country for all first responders, and then for our military community as well. And then also the family members.
Yeah.
So some that we haven't really talked about is that we talked about the transition from active to retirement and the identity and everything, but the adjustment back to like kids after you retire, back to your spouse or significant others after retirement. For them, I don't know of any sort of training, any proactive steps that we have in place for them to be able to be like, hey, this is what your service member or your first responder may be going through or may be thinking.
Yeah. My own experience with that, I was married for almost 20 years. Same amount of time I was in the military. And when I retired is when I got divorced. So that in particular for me, you know, I definitely have experience with that. I additional support outside of the military is super important, not only for the service member or the now veteran, if you will, and their families. And, you know, being able to talk to spouses and kids and everything else, like, I certainly didn't pay attention to that enough. You know, when I left the military, I just knew like, hey, I got this retirement, you know, I have all these responsibilities as a provider. You know, I got to find a job when I get out, like, you know, can't live off the retirement because it's DOD.
Yes.
You know, granted, I'm super grateful that I have it. So I'm not complaining, but you know, I had to find another job, you know, and I was still able-bodied and everything else. And like, I wanted to work, you know, I was back into the civilian world and I was like, hey, what do I do now? And, but that process and kind of everything that I worked through and that it took a serious toll on my marriage and my kids and everything else, you know, still things I look back on that certain things I regret about that, you know, that, and I'm at peace with a lot of that now. But it's like, dude, like I probably should have been in like marriage counseling when I first got out, you know, because my whole identity had shifted. Like I wasn't a Green Beret anymore. Like I wasn't doing this high speed shit, you know, like you know, my whole existence was different, you know, and I was like, what the fuck do I do now? You know, like what's ever going to compare to that, you know?
Nothing may ever compare to it when you're done with it. And in retirement life, you're just essentially done.
Yeah, exactly. That part, you know, the way that I've like worked through all of that is that part's always going to hold a really special place in my life. And I'm very proud of that. But there's a lot more life to live.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm a dad now or still. And, you know, my kids, I have 2 in college, 1's still with me. And, you know, I don't always do the best about communication and everything else, but, you know, I love them incredibly. And, you know, I try to be into those, you know, be closer to those things now and pay more close attention to all of that because, again, they're all still here.
Yeah.
You know, and life it's an interesting ride, you know, but again, like, you know, like we've talked about a little bit, I think a lot of my experiences and background with resiliency and all the things that I've been through, it just drives me to keep pushing you know, and to realize, hey, it's okay at times to take a knee and ask for help, but you know, ultimately I'm going to keep pushing because that's just how I am.
Yep.
You know,
and I feel like our entire community, that's exactly how you are.
Yeah.
Like how everybody is, where it's like, I know I got a lot of shit going on, everything, but I'm going to push.
Yeah.
Because that's how you're taught in basic training, boot camp, your police academy, your fire academy. Like, yes, I'm hurting. Yes, I have a lot of weight on my fucking back. But if you stop XYZ, blah, 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 whatever. So it's kind of just ingrained in you. In your experience of service and with your family, and having friends who have ultimately taken their lives, just like me and a lot of people in our community, it's kind of one of those unfortunate common themes where I'd say a majority of our community knows someone who has died by suicide. What advice do you have? What can we do to better help our community?
Well, one, what you're doing right now, you know, bringing awareness, that's big, right? Also, I think hearing from people that have done the job and hearing, you know, from senior people in positions, people that have done the job, people that talk about their own personal experiences that are humble enough to step in front of a camera, jump on a podcast and tell everybody, hey, it's okay to ask for help. You know, I think that's important. So awareness, just continuing to push, you know, like in what you guys are doing, you know, where you're raising money, you're being transparent about what you're doing with the money, you're getting people help, it's making a difference. That's super important, obviously. You know, again, if there's anything I could ever say to anybody that's listening and they're struggling is like, don't be afraid to get help. Like, you know, hurting yourself and then everybody around you, you know, is not the answer. And that, you know, things can get better, you know, and just like you've worked to be, you know, worked your ass off to be a cop or a firefighter or a soldier or a Green Beret or a SEAL or whatever, you know, you have to put work in to take care of yourself. And it's not selfish. You know, so kind of redefining the way that we look at things and then making sure, you know, that leadership is set up in a way where they don't punish people, you know, for getting help. Like you may actually just have extended that person's career to be a positive contributor on the team, you know, for who knows how much extra time, right? If they just had a little release valve, you know, to be able to work through something and then continue on. And then who knows, that person then becomes another positive influence, you know, that affects 10 other people, you know, or one day they grow into that leadership position. They've been through all that and they're able to help do that. There has to be a vision, right, of that to kind of help all of this get better, you know?
Yeah. No, I love it. I appreciate you, you sharing that and giving your insight. I think you're a really good speaker and you're really intelligent.
You talk really good.
You talk good, sir. Something that I should have mentioned before, and this was your first combat deployment. You were awarded the Purple Heart.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The enemy marksmanship badge is it's commonly referred to.
Okay. So, I just like a minute or two, just shed some light on, like how it felt to be awarded the Purple Heart, how you feel about it, and what it means to you.
Yeah. One, it's the award nobody wants to get. For a variety of reasons, but it's certainly not one I wanted. I think it does mean a lot to me. You know, it's a recognition of essentially like, hey man, I've been there and done the job and, you know, I've got essentially the physical wounds to prove it, you know, but I kind of humbly look at all of that. You know, I would never, it's not something that I think openly talk about. My Purple Heart in particular, I thought was cool because General Petraeus at the time was the guy that signed it. So like, there's all these.
You're excited for.
You know, I thought he was a good leader at the time and everything else. Certainly, the guy rose to different ranks, you know, within DOD and the U.S. government or whatever. But I had some interactions with him when I was a young non-commissioned officer, and I always really appreciated him and had some positive experiences talking to him. So the fact that he was the guy that, was on my Purple Heart, I thought that was cool. Yeah, man. I mean, there's a lot of folks out there. I'm still moving around and I'm banged up. I'm older now. But there's a lot of guys that have Purple Hearts that aren't with us anymore. A lot of guys that are, amputees and everything else. And yeah, man, I love all those dudes and their families and everything else. And, that award obviously should be recognized, but I certainly, wouldn't consider myself someone that stands out for that. You know what I mean? But all the guys that, are missing limbs and, aren't with us anymore, those are the guys that I would choose to bring attention to about that award. So, and their families. Yeah, there's certainly a big amount of people, that have that award that have paid a lot for the country, and they deserve to be taken care of and looked out for, in my opinion. That's what I think about the Purple Heart.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you. I felt it's important to have you talk about and share that. Before we wrap it up and I ask the final question,
Uh-oh.
what
does that mean?
I would like to know, are there any of your fellow teammates, service members that you would like to, and I've never done this before, but to recognize or to say their name and where they were from, what they did.
Yeah.
Someone who either died in combat, given their life for our country, or unfortunately died by their own hands and by suicide.
Yeah.
So no pressure whatsoever. Like I said, I've never done this before.
No, it's okay. Yeah.
But yeah, if you're comfortable doing that, just
I am.
Take whatever time you need.
No, I appreciate that. I'm eager to tell that story because I would probably much more like to talk about, these folks than I would myself, right? Because these guys all in their own ways had a lot of impact on me.
Yeah.
First one is Benjamin Franklin Bittner, the guy I wear on my wrist. I think I mentioned him earlier on in the podcast. We were teammates for several years. Senior dude in SF when I got there. Absolute monster of a Green Beret in every way you could be. Like the most aggressive dude on the team, literally, would chase the bad guys anywhere. Just a model non-commissioned officer, like led from the front, just an absolute warrior. And unfortunately, he was killed in 2011 when he stepped on a pressure plate in Afghanistan. He was serving at that time as a Special Forces team sergeant, so leading other Green Berets on the ground. Survived by his wife, April Bittner, and his son, Gunnar Bittner, who I still am in contact with and love very much. And think about them a lot. And I think about Ben a lot, and I wear him on my wrist as a reminder that I was lucky enough to be around some really good people. And I still look at that and use that as a guide for my own life now to not let those guys down. And then I had another teammate, Joel Mitchell, who was a really good guy. And unfortunately, through addiction, Joel overdosed after he retired. And I can think of different instances where downrange, he saved my life in several gunfights when we were in SF together. And he was just a really good guy, and it was sad that that's how things ended for him. And, survived essentially by his ex-wife and his daughter. And, that's hard, man. It's hard when dudes that and love, end up, whether it's through addiction or suicide or whatever, that's the way things end. So that was obviously really hard. And then my first LURS team leader, a guy named Adrian Alizalde, we spent a year together in Iraq, my first deployment. And unfortunately, Adrian was killed in, I think, 2007. I happened to be in 1st Special Forces Group in Iraq. Unfortunately, he was killed in an IED strike as well on his vehicle. And I mean, if you go to my Instagram page, on Memorial Day, I typically put pictures up of guys that I've known, throughout when I was in the military for almost 20 years that were killed in action, or, had something not great happen or whatever. And, I try to look at those and remind myself that, again, if I'm still here, I have a responsibility to tell their story, because they were absolute giants among men, and, really good guys, and they were good to the people around them, and, made a positive difference in the world. So it's important to say their names and remember them. And, for me, for this, those would be the guys that I would choose to remember for the podcast for this.
Cool.
So,
yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing. And I know with your, I guess, caliber of experience and your years of service for the country, and it's an honor to finally do this podcast and have you sitting here and like being able to share all of your experiences and the heroes that unfortunately we have lost, and
yeah,
amongst all the others. And it's something that I hold near and dear to my heart. I know
sure.
I'm a very patriotic dude, and other than just Memorial Day, like I wake up every day and like I look at the flag and I think about how many fucking men and women have died protecting our country,
Yeah.
For our freedom. So I appreciate you taking the time to mention them, to share a little bit about them, who they're survived by. And I think it's important to dedicate this podcast to them.
Absolutely. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. And I know there's many more out there, but
Yeah.
to all of you that are listening who have to lost a loved one or a friend in combat or by suicide, it's not an easy thing to go through whatsoever. Losing someone to combat, no matter how he or she died, I think, as we've talked about enough, is kind of what you signed up for. It's a part of the job. It's the longer you're in, the more fucked up shit you're going to see. But not to denote that at all, but the suicide is really like, we have some amazing men and women that have done amazing things for our country. And like, if you're out there listening and you're a service member, a first responder, supporter, family member, and you need any additional resources, or you know of a service member or first responder who's struggling and who may be raising those red flags, and you're concerned at all about considering dying by suicide, like, please reach out to me, reach out to Kurt. And I think we would probably do whatever we can to get them on the right path and the right direction. Is it okay for those listening to reach out to you, or
sure? Yeah.
If someone wanted to talk to you more, if we
Yeah.
touched on something within the past 3 hours of this podcast that someone had questions on or wanted to thank you for, or talk or comments or anything, is that okay for listeners?
Yeah, I'm totally cool with that. If I can ever be of any help to guide somebody in a good direction or just have a chat, like, I'm always, and I've been doing that. I felt through a different endeavor right before I got to where I am now professionally. I built a fairly decent following on social media. And, I've certainly had good conversations with people that, needed to be pointed in the right direction to get some help. And I have no issues doing that at all. So my username on Instagram is Kurt_that_team_dude. And I'm sure Greg will, throw it up once he puts it on the Overwatch Collective's social media and everything else. Only thing I ask for is be patient. I have a full-time job as well, and I'm still supporting myself and my kids, and trying to live a productive life. So if I don't get to you right away, I apologize, but I certainly look at my DMs and have a special place in my heart for first responders, obviously through my own experiences with my dad, and then of course, folks that are in the military. So, and I mean, yeah, if you're a family member or whatever, and you're like, hey, like, can you point us in the right direction? I'm more than happy to do that as well. So absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Final question we ask everybody on the podcast.
Fuck.
It's not that big of a deal. You're like sitting there stressing, sweating. It's not that big of a deal. So I mentioned it earlier. Obviously, so the Overwatch Collective, our motto is one more is one less. So
Yeah.
A fellow soldier, season 1, episode 6, Jack.
Okay.
So he was 11 Bravo.
Yeah.
So he talked about during that episode losing friends in combat, but
Sure.
losing more upon return stateside to suicide.
Okay.
So he brought it up. He was like, one more that we can help is one less potential suicide. So that became the motto. It's on the t-shirts, it's on the coins, it's on the sleeves of some of our merchandise.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cool. Every single time that we ask someone what one more is one less means to them, it's always a different response. So it's kind of cool to hear everybody's response. So what I do is at the end of each episode, after everything that we've talked about, taking everything into consideration, we like to ask what one more is one less means to you. So
got it.
Take your time if you want.
Yeah.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to hear what one more is one less means to you.
Yeah. One more is one less. I mean, the bottom line is I think it's a summation of all the things we just talked about for the last couple hours. If I could influence, leadership of an organization to make sure they're taking care of their people, if this resonated with someone individually, and then, that slogan and what it means, I mean, we should all have an actor. If you're the family member of a first responder, if you're a first responder, if you've been if you were a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, we should have a collective interest in helping take care of each other. Yes, there are programs that the government, provides taxpayer dollars for to do that, but we should have a more vested interest in that. And so, one more is one less would be a collective community looking out for each other and caring for one another. That's what that means to me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Any last words?
I don't think so, man. I appreciate you having me on. Thanks for your hospitality. And, again, we talked about this a while ago. I was excited to do it. And again, I wanted to drive towards kind of some of my own experiences, but more so kind of sharing that. So hopefully that, helps somebody. And if I did that for one person, this was worth doing and taking the time. So I appreciate it.
Boom. That's the whole mission.
Yeah.
Cool. I appreciate it. Shout out to Eli. Thank you for being behind the scenes and taking care of us and doing all of our editing. So thank you once again. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And God bless America.
America.